Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 91 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. As always, we got a bunch of stuff to cover here today. We're going to be covering everything that happened this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, this week in geopolitics. This is hard talk about hard money and the implications that it has in the real world as we prepare you to transition for this world of AI, central bank digital currencies, and of course, Bitcoin as a peaceful resistance to protect yourself and opt out of the system that is being built. And we had lots of updates this week. We had the Genius Act pass, and it was signed by Trump. But I had a little bit of time to dig deeper, and we're going to be answering the question: does the Genius Act enable a covert central bank digital currency? We're going to discuss that and more, and the impact in macro and geopolitics. If we have not met already, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 25 years of my life obsessing over the topic of money, investing, and I combined that with geofinance. And when Bitcoin came along, I've been there for the last 14 years, helping people understand the importance of owning more Bitcoin each month. And I'll be reiterating the importance of that throughout, as well as all the news that happened this week, and tie it into educational pieces, so that each week we're smarter and more prepared. And I'd like to get as many people to be smarter and more prepared as possible. So in part one of this show, This Week in Bitcoin, I'm going to be digging deeper into all the news that happened this week, but also answering the question: does the Genius Act enable a covert US central bank digital currency? We'll be answering that. In part two, This Week in Macro, I'm going to be going into Trump's humiliation ritual at the Federal Reserve with Jerome Powell, what it means and the implications for the wider macro, and also why war profits are soaring at the moment. And I'm going to answer the question with a blog that I posted this week for those that want to do more details on who really rules the world, and specifically who's behind the Proof of Weapons network. We're going to be covering all of that. And in part three, This Week in Geopolitics, we're going to be going through basically who's really profiting from all of this surveillance that we are ushering in and all of this war that we are ushering in. I'm also going to be covering the latest on the China-Taiwan situation and the Russia-Ukraine situation, as well as a few tidbits from what's happening in the Middle East. And I'm going to leave with one final thing. It's going to be a packed show. And we're going to be leaving with the final step on what you can do in order to boycott much of the war that I call the Proof of Weapons network. So without further ado, let's jump right into part one, This Week in Bitcoin. There was a study that came out today, which was very promising. I've been encouraging people to boycott the Federal Reserve by saving in Bitcoin for the last 14 years. And I've also been encouraging them to do it and hold it in self-custody, so you can boycott the asset managers like BlackRock as well. And the more Bitcoin we have in self-custody, the better. Because there was Operation Choke Point 2.0, which was a very deliberate operation in order to allow the traditional financial players to persuade you to own as much of your Bitcoin with them so that they can profit and benefit from it and make themselves more powerful as they take over states and countries and manage this transition over to this multipolar world, with Bitcoin being the peaceful resistance. And many of the traditional financial players want to get you to own your Bitcoin with them instead of you owning it in self-custody. But the report showed that approximately 74% of all Bitcoin is now held by long-term holders. Now, that's a range of a self-custody and custody. But when you analyze the blockchain in terms of individual holders that are holding and have held for the long term, this is a 15-year high, which is very, very encouraging. So Bitcoin is really on the right track, but that doesn't mean we should get complacent, because all the newbies, they're going to be offering all sorts of incentives for you to hold your Bitcoin with them in custody. And if you didn't have a chance to read my blog where I did a debate on custody and self-custody, make sure you head over to simondixon.com and check it out. You can watch the long form debate, or you can watch a little AI summary just in case you haven't got the time to do it. I understand I give you a lot more. But also, what is very encouraging is one of the early 2011 addresses. This is when I first presented at the first Bitcoin conference, and I started writing my book in 2010. That was also the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. But there were 80,000 Bitcoin that moved from one of the old 2011 addresses. Now, at today's value, that's approximately $9 billion. And this week, they were sent over to Galaxy Digital. And what is remarkable is that they were either gobbled up over the counter by people that were trying to persuade people to either sell those 80,000 Bitcoin or transfer them into some kind of trust structure or something more tax efficient for that billionaire. But what is interesting is it did not barely move the market at all. On the day, Bitcoin was down just 4%, which is very, 4% off the all-time high. So an 80,000 Bitcoin sell worth $9 billion has the demand. And that is how far and how liquid this market has become right now. At the same time, Trump Media, his public company on the New York Stock Exchange, or is it basically said that they've disclosed that they now hold that $2 billion worth of Bitcoin. And they're doing it through both Bitcoin and Bitcoin-related investments. So I'm sure they're using their leverage in their position to own mining companies and various other parts of the ecosystem and doing lots of backhand deals that we've been covering. But anyway, $2 billion in Trump Media, taking essentially a social network that only the craziest MAGA fans probably use, and turn it into a Bitcoin treasury company, as well as other strategic assets related to the Bitcoin sector. So that's approximately 2/3 of the $3 billion in liquid assets that Trump Media holds is now held in Bitcoin, which is, a 66% treasury position, which is very, very bullish of Bitcoin from the president of the United States, which essentially is a short dollar trade, which is very interesting, especially as he's launching stablecoins through World Liberty Financial that benefit from higher interest rates at the same time as advocating for the short-term interest rates. But in the macro side, we'll be going through the humiliation ritual between Trump and Jerome Powell. So in terms of the public companies that are now holding Bitcoin, and by the way, I always need to reiterate this if you're new to the show, I don't recommend anyone should be buying Bitcoin through these public companies unless there is a very specific reason. Maybe you've got pension money that you can't unlock, and maybe they don't allow you to buy a Bitcoin ETF or anything like that. And so therefore you need exposure in your country. And so therefore you go via a Bitcoin proxy, which is what a lot of these treasury companies are doing. They're raising money on the debt capital markets to give corporate bond investors the ability to get exposure to Bitcoin. Then they're raising that money and buying Bitcoin in these equity capital markets. Therefore, those that need exposure to Bitcoin but can only do it via these mechanisms are able to get exposure. For the average person, Bitcoin in self-custody is where we need to get to. But I understand if there's a bit of financial planning around that. But Strategy, which is the largest publicly traded Bitcoin proxy, which has both an operating company and a Bitcoin treasury, now owns 770,000 Bitcoin. So that's approximately approaching 608,000 Bitcoin. Approximately, what's that, about, just got over 1% of the supply. And now, when you take that in comparison to, we're talking the largest companies in the world, the tech magnificent seven, the largest companies listed on the US stock market, they're now in the top 10 as in terms of value of their treasury, which is absolutely remarkable. It's just showing what Bitcoin can do to a company. And so Strategy now holds approximately $71 billion worth of Bitcoin. Obviously, that changes. Now, in terms of public company treasuries, that ranks Strategy, the ragtag software company, In terms of the Standard & Poor's, the 500 largest stocks in America in that index, it's now got the 9th largest treasury in the world. To give you context, the largest treasury, and treasury just means the amount of money that these public companies hold on reserve. Berkshire Hathaway, who has been selling down their Apple stock and deleveraging, and now has $410 billion in their treasury. Now, treasury means that it's cash equivalent. You either hold it in US dollar treasuries, i.e. lend it to the US government, or you hold it in gold, or you hold it in Bitcoin now as well. The second largest treasury on the S&P 500 is Amazon, that holds $157 billion. The third largest is Google, $148 billion. The fourth is Microsoft, $132 billion. The fifth is Apple with $131 billion. Sixth is Ford with $105 billion. Then you have Tesla with $95 billion, of which approximately $1 billion or so is the Bitcoin position. Then you have General Motors, $89 billion. And ninth in terms of the S&P 500 is Strategy, with, at the time of this, the Bitcoin strategic reserves were valued at $77 billion. The price has come down a little bit since then. So it just shows that just through using these mechanisms and holding Bitcoin in treasury, you can outperform all of... Now, remember, this is somebody that came to the market in 2020. I always get this. It's too late. I missed the boat. Bitcoin is a fixed supply. And so he's still buying the top, and he says he'll be buying the top forever. And that is what I've always been teaching ever since $3 to today, that you earn fiat currency, you save it in Bitcoin, and historically, everyone that's done that for 4 years has outperformed all the fund managers, everyone on Wall Street, gold, real estate, every asset class. And when you price any asset class in Bitcoin, they've all been in a bear market relative to Bitcoin, because people have this illusion. When you price things in fiat currency, which are depreciating, they lose their store of value, they lose their value over time. It looks like stocks and real estate are going up in value, but they're actually debasing the currency. So if you want reality, price things in gold and price things in Bitcoin, and you realize everything's in a bear market relative to Bitcoin, particularly in Japan. And we've covered this many times. But what is, Japan had its treasury company that got record volume, again, by holding Bitcoin on its balance sheet for Metaplanet, rather. But now there's more Japanese companies that are jumping on the bandwagon. And where this becomes interesting is you've now got a Japanese AI company. It's called Quantum. And it is planning to buy $356 million worth of Bitcoin in the next 12 months. So this is an aspiring artificial intelligence company that is also going to be using Bitcoin as its strategic reserves. And I think you're going to see more and more of this, just as the Bitcoin mining companies are also repurposing some of their data centers. While they're mining Bitcoin, they're also providing compute for artificial intelligence. And companies like Core Scientific are doing that, which is why it was acquired for approximately $9 billion by CoreWeave and various other data centers, as we start to enter into this world of Bitcoin AI and central bank digital currencies. And all of those are moving forward. Now, the CBDCs are tools for oppression. Artificial intelligence is here to take your job, and Bitcoin is here to protect you from both the surveillance, it's money you can own without a bank, money you can spend without government permission, and money that has a fixed supply, so you don't need to worry about what the central banksters are doing, as I'll be covering this week in macro. So it adds simplicity to your life, so you can figure out how to earn more fiat currency and adjust to this artificial intelligence world, and then save it in Bitcoin, knowing that you don't have to mess around with the markets, and you can just watch Bitcoin Hard Talk every week, make sure you're up to date with what's happening, but simplify your life. And even if you want to go more advanced, you can do that with the information I'll be sharing. But everybody can have the simple strategy, and we all need more simplicity in this environment where we're moving towards exponential change. Humans are not set out for exponential change. We are in for the most changing time in human history ahead of us with all of this artificial intelligence and robotics. And Bitcoin is designed to give you some simplicity so that you don't need to spend all your time figuring out how to hand over your money to Wall Street. And the fixed supply means that you've got that commodity-like feature that once you understand Bitcoin, you don't really need to understand anything else. And not only are we seeing artificial intelligence companies putting Bitcoin on as a treasury on their balance sheet, we also are starting to see more and more gold mining companies that are putting Bitcoin as their treasury. So while they're mining Bitcoin, while they're mining for gold, they're taking some of those dollar returns and they're converting them to Bitcoin on their treasury balance sheet. This really is a play of digging gold out of the ground and converting it to Bitcoin as we enter into this world of hard money. And many Bitcoiners don't like gold. I'm a big fan of gold as a physical scarce asset. But Bitcoin's the ultimate because then you can use it. It doesn't suffer from some of the problems of storing it without holding it with a custodian because you can self-custody it and you can transport it around the world. And if your jurisdiction gets very oppressive, currently like the UK is doing, we're going to go a bit more into that, then you can exit the country with your wealth and it will come with you without having to physically store that value, and you can audit it on the blockchain wherever you are in the world, which is remarkable. And more people are discovering that. Now, of these Bitcoin treasury companies, these public companies that are there's over 100 of them now, and people are tracking them all. From the top 100 Bitcoin treasury companies, which I've warned everyone against. It will be used as a psyop for those that control the money printers to engineer the game to fool you into selling your Bitcoin. I'm not going to go deeper into that. You can check out previous videos. I catalog them all on my YouTube channel, break them up into smaller topics so you don't have to watch the whole thing. But you can start to go back and pick out the topics you like as well. But now these Bitcoin treasury companies, in just a small period of time, they now own 853 Bitcoin just in the top 100 treasury companies. So it is eating the stock market and it is demonetizing dollars as treasury asset reserves after strategy kind of led the charge. At the same time, America's moving into a deregulation environment under the Trump administration. I've got lots of criticism for the Trump administration, as we'll be covering in the macro and geopolitical section, just as I did for the Biden. I don't care about party politics. I just care about you protecting yourself and making yourself great again, because they ain't going to make America great again, and they're not going to make your country great again. When you understand how the proof of weapons network works, you'll know that governments are subordinate to corporate interests, and we'll be going to dive more into that today in part 2 and part 3. But in terms of this deregulation environment, the FBI has now dropped the investigation under the Biden administration into Kraken. This is because Operation Choke Point 2.0 under the Biden administration, with Gary Gensler as head of the SEC and Jerome Powell as head of the Federal Reserve, and Biden as head of the government in the United States with the Democrat administration, they executed an operation in order to take down, through planting SBF into FTX and Mizhinsky into Celsius, ways of stealing a lot of money, crashing the market, taking out the crypto-friendly banks like Silvergate, Signature, and Silicon Valley Bank, and then allowing BlackRock to get the Bitcoin ETF approved so that they can fool you into getting as much of their Bitcoin held with them, rather than you holding it in self-custody. Fortunately, Bitcoin is proof of work, so it doesn't matter who owns it in terms of controlling the network. But anyway, during this, they came after all the crypto exchanges. Full disclosure, I'm an early shareholder in Kraken and over 100 different Bitcoin companies before the vulture capitalists and the financial terrorists came along. It was a grassroots movement where we were funding the companies. I invested in Kraken as a very early investor. They're about to go public now, so you'll be able to invest on the public markets. But now the FBI has launched the investigation into the founder, Jesse Powell, who was at the very first Bitcoin conference in the world, a Bitcoin OG that dedicated his life to, exposing the financial weapons of mass destruction and various other surveillance state tools, as was this bottom-up movement in Bitcoin against the banks. But they've now dropped the investigation as well. So congratulations, Jesse Powell and the team at Kraken. Now, in 2016, I also became a shareholder in Bitfinex because I helped the victims of a hack, 119,000 Bitcoin that was hacked, and turn their whole into shares in the company. And so I became a shareholder in Bitfinex as a result of that, as did many of the other victims. But the sister company, Tether, who created the largest stablecoin in the world, that has now led to all of these changes in Genius Act that we'll be covering, and have about $165 billion behind that stablecoin. They're now planning, after being targeted by the US, and there were many targets by the US. I remember many of it when they seized funds of Tether. That created a hole, and they had to launch a token that was backed by the return of coins and all sorts of financial engineering that needed to be done to survive. They survived. They did. But they ended up having to store, their treasuries with financial terrorists like Cantor Fitzgerald, headed by Howard Lutnick in the Trump administration, the neighbor of Jeffrey Epstein. You don't even want to go down these circles. But anyway, they're holding their treasuries with the Federal Reserve discount broker. And obviously, recently they came into the White House, and now there's this large crypto lobby. There's all the usual types of shenanigans in games. This is why I just focus on Bitcoin and self-custody. I'm looking over time to, as these companies go public, I'll be selling down my shares and converting it into Bitcoin. I don't want to be involved in all these human risks. My job was done to support the industry where it's needed. Now it's a massive industry, and I feel my focus is on getting people to own Bitcoin and self-custody. But anyway, Tether is now planning to launch a US version of the stablecoin because of the Genius Act and the regulatory structure. So they're going to have a two-tiered stablecoin. It's like a US-based stablecoin, and then Tether as we know it today. So we'll see what that actually means. So with that, I want to go through what was actually in the Genius Act. So it was pitched as America becoming the crypto capital of the world. But anybody that's following me for a long time, you know that America is converting into a regional technocracy for artificial intelligence and robotics. And based upon the structure of the proof of weapons network, it is subordinate to the asset managers and BlackRock's interests. And so the government no longer works for the American people, just like we saw in UK and Europe and various other jurisdictions that I'll be covering more in the macro. But it needed stable coins in order to create what I believe is a covert form of central bank digital currency. Now, part of the bills that was passing, there were three bills. There was Genius Act for stablecoins. There was Clarity Act for deciding how you register with the various regulators. And there was the Anti-CBDC Act. Now, the Anti-CBDC Act, as I covered in previous episodes, was about making sure that Congress, if they wanted a CBDC, it would have to go via Congress. And so you can stop a CBDC happening via Congress. But as with America, and as the Constitution was designed, it was always designed to protect Americans from the tyranny of government, but never the tyranny of the corporations controlling the government. So it was always a covert mechanism for having rule by a corptocracy. And now all those corporations have become in technology. It's a technocracy. But the Genius Act was effectively meant to kill the CBDC. And you had PR and propaganda. This week, there was someone from, what was his name? Bo Hines that came out and said, yeah, this kills the CBDC. And that is actually true. It has to go via Congress in order to achieve it. But what it does is it forces stable coins into some kind of compliance and control structure, like a central bank digital currency, but issued by the banks and non-banks, and it separates those into two. So it is functionally identical to a central bank digital currency, with the exception of monetary policy. So many people talk about the Federal Reserve creating money, and it does through quantitative easing. But primarily, money is created by the private banks. And that's why the banks met on Jekyll Island in order to construct the Federal Reserve System, so that it could have a lender of last resort for bank failures, so it could socialize losses, privatize gains, create a moral hazard, as we saw in the 2008 financial crisis, but also be able to create the digital dollar every time they issue a loan in a debt-based Ponzi scheme that guaranteed that individuals, governments, and corporations would have to go into ever-increasing levels of debt, and then they could use those debt capital markets to manipulate the equity capital markets and effectively create what America is today. $37 trillion of government debt, massive consumer debt, and corporate debt that is utilized by large corporations in order to pump up their equity prices so that they can enrich themselves. And it's crony capitalism to the highest level, because it's all guaranteed by the government and the Federal Reserve System, which has these deposit insurance for only 1% of the deposits. Essentially, the central bank digital currency is a private bank digital currency. But because the technology companies and fintech companies and Tether and Circle, full disclosure, was another company I invested in, started as a Bitcoin company and then later became a stablecoin company, and is now public as well. It went public recently. You essentially had these private corporations that can issue central bank digital currencies. They're backed by US debt. They work on a one-to-one basis rather than fractional reserve. So they don't create digital dollars every time they issue a loan. They create digital dollars every time someone deposits a dollar. And then they use that dollar to buy treasuries, which is lending it to the US government. And so it created this mechanism whereby you can have full reserve banking outside of the banking system, but also is backed by US government debt. And obviously, these are centralized companies. It's not like Bitcoin. So you have to opt into all the surveillance and the ability to freeze funds and everything that now the Genius Act, the Clarity Act, and the Anti-CBDC Act will require, particularly the Genius Act as well. And so you have functionality identical to CBDCs, but you don't have the centralized control by one central bank. In effect, this hands over control to Treasury rather than independence by the central bank. But the technocrats and financial institutions still get to create the digital dollar. The government gets to borrow, but the Federal Reserve System is a two-tiered system. You have full reserves with stable coins, and you have fractional reserves, and you can use essentially the collateral of the funds that you hold with the Federal Reserve System using these stable coins. And that is what the Genius Act achieved. Now, I know that that's a bit of a mess up in your head. Only for someone that's been studying these things for a long time might understand those. But I'll go a little bit deeper. I know it's a little bit geeky, but the devil's in the detail, because many people think that this is about giving people more freedom. No, it's the exact opposite. It's about this two-tiered system where BlackRock controls the European Union and actually has a digital euro and central bank digital currency, while having a technocracy in the host of the largest capital market, America. And then you usher in integrations with Palantir, AI, and the surveillance state. And you only resist by holding your funds in Bitcoin and limiting the amount that you put in a bank or the amount that you use with these stable coins. But the difference is that a stable coin is created by a bank and a non-bank financial institution. And so this was a regulatory regime for those banks and non-banks. And of course, there was the crypto lobby that was pushing through favorable regulations for stablecoin issuers. And there was the banking lobby that was pushing through favorable terms for banks over stablecoin issuers. And guess what? The banks won and the stablecoin issuers won. And there is this power struggle between the technocrats, the technical industrial complex, and the financial industrial complex factions of the proof of weapons network. And so the very few discussions, and I was invited, I did a space this week with George Gammon. I've been on his show many times in the past. Well, once in the past, actually, not many times, but came up on some of his spaces. And I'm going to be doing another show with him next week. I was invited to join him on his podcast. But the thing that very few discussed, and I had to bring it to many people's attention, is that there is essentially a new monetary system that was negotiated into this Genius Act. Because under the Genius Act, there's a few things that people didn't notice, and only a geek like me would dig into these things and start to think about the implications. Of course, the banks knew, but they're shadowy behind the scenes, rigging the system in their favor, which is why when people talk about, I've always said central bank digital currencies and stablecoins, they don't compete with Bitcoin, they compete with bank deposits. And the banks are having a two-tiered game here based upon this evolving new system, because you can have one surveillance system and one shadowy fractional reserve system to maximize profits. But there was a clause that very few people were talking about, and that is that banks in the Genius Act can now use their reserve balances that they hold at the Federal Reserve. So every bank that has a clearing account with the Federal Reserve, they have to hold the reserves. That's why it's called fractional reserves. But those reserves are not held in cash, they're held in assets. And so really there's no reserves because it's held by assets, which is a loan to the government. And that's all backed up by the credit, the credit worthiness of the government that is increasingly being downgraded by S&P, by Moody's, and the various, and Fitch and the other credit rating agencies. But now they can take the balance that they have with the Federal Reserve and they can collateralize it in order to back a stable coin. And so this is essentially, it means that about 17 years after these Basel reforms of trapped bank reserves that was meant to make the banking system more stable, is going to be able to be unlocked by turning it into a stable coin. So this essentially releases approximately $3.5 trillion of additional liquid capital, which will be acting as a stimulus, because essentially money at the Federal Reserve becomes part of the broader money supply. And that was injected into the Genius Act. And it means that banks immediately get to issue these stable coins and kind of get a head start in the industry. And under Genius, basically that collateral, once you issue a stable coin against it, it cannot be rehypothecated in order to protect the integrity of it. But remember what we've seen in stablecoins. Stablecoins are pegged to the dollar because the asset is worth $1. And you can take the loan to the government that pays yield, as in bonds, and Tether, for example, converts it all into Bitcoin in order to get more Bitcoin. And that's the business model. But you can't rehypothecate these funds. And so you get an additional yield by pushing out these stable coins, which is less profitable than the fractional reserve. So what is it that they're actually after? Well, they're after the programmability and the surveillance that you can put in there, and making sure that they have a head start over the traditional fintech non-bank stablecoin issuers as well. So anyway, in the Federal Reserve account, they can hold either treasuries or reverse repos and repurchase agreements, which I don't want to go too deep into. But basically, they can issue their stable coins based upon having that backing. And if there's any distress in the repo market or in the treasury market, Now, normally they hold those to maturity, so it doesn't matter if there's any fluctuations. But when people want to redeem those stable coins in a moment, you can essentially have a run on the stable coin. And you may eventually, with these banks, package that up into the FDIC system, which means socialize the losses and privatize the gains as well. So it's adding essentially additional risk into it when it could have just been a demonetization tool for the banks. Because if you transfer it from your bank deposit to a non-bank, then that money is moving from fractional reserve to full reserve. Instead, they gave the banks essentially an effective monopoly by having these Fed accounts that can be converted into stable coins. Now, once it is a stable coin, it can't be used as collateral anywhere else. They can't use it again on their balance sheet, which banks get to do with their double accounting fractional reserve banking. But it means that you have that stable coin, and it becomes an integral part of the money supply. So now stable coins are effectively deeply integrated into this system. And obviously the government wants to perpetuate more dollars out there so that it can back it by more debt. And you effectively have a form of modern monetary theory so that the government gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the banks can profit from it, but the Federal Reserve is no longer needed in that mechanism. And you can manage a phase out of the Federal Reserve system and full control into a stablecoin standard backed by US government debt, which is a form of modern monetary theory, but handing over the interest directly to the banks as well. So they could see that the writing was on the wall, and they quickly transferred it into another debt-based Ponzi scheme, while we have these stable coins that are full reserve. Anyway, bank reserves are currently useless, and now they can be useful. So you can imagine that. Currently with bank reserves, they're currently used to clear settlements between each other. So if you have one bank that has more deposits and reserves than withdrawals, then you can clear between each other. And if they need access to fast cash, you have these products like repo markets where they can lend to each other. Currently, on average, less than 100 billion is needed on a weekly basis to handle settlements from these actual reserves. So they'll keep some of it in reserves, and then they can use it to issue the stable coin. This is essentially turning their bank reserves into stable coins, which unlocks that $3.5 trillion of liquidity and that was stuck inside the Federal Reserve System. Now, you can imagine that this will lead to a surge in digital liquidity that will be used in likelihood to pump the Bitcoin market as well. And so what I want people to understand is that we're benefiting from a two-tiered system in Bitcoin. While the banks and financial institutions are trying to catch up with Bitcoin and they're trying to use this technology to build the new rails, your job is to end up converting your stablecoin into Bitcoin and holding it in self-custody. So you can benefit from the fact that banks are pumping in new liquidity that eventually will replicate the same system that will create the demand eventually for those that have these Bitcoin equivalents and IOUs to need to convert them into Bitcoin in self-custody that is backed by real Bitcoin. And therefore, that creates kind of a short squeeze if they start engaging in these types of short-term manipulations. They will not be able to take a fixed supply asset, and the self-custody Bitcoin will be a two-tiered economy in the IOU Bitcoin that the banks will be messing with as well. And so they get these additional liquidity through stablecoins without actually having to issue new loans, create new dollars, and have to take on the credit risk of the traditional bank lending model. In effect, this is a functional money supply that's kind of operating within a shadow quantitative easing style of structure that is essentially a covert stimulus. Hence why the conclusion is the Genius Act has enabled a stimulus and a quasi-covert central bank digital currency controlled by the technocrats without the central bank and without centralizing it fully like they are in Europe and like they're planning to do. And so, this is an improvement, but you just need to be aware to limit your exposure and why, in the end, it's a two-tiered system. As the banks are levering up, a bunch of liquidity is going into Bitcoin that want to protect themselves. And when banks collapse, or when banks hit an over-leverage moment, or we have a next black swan event, Bitcoin is the solution. But you won't be able to convert to Bitcoin during the crisis. So your job is to manage that, which is the whole point of money you can own without a bank, money you can spend without government permission, and money that has a fixed supply when they go through these different types of risks, because the stable coins will be backed one-to-one by US dollars or treasuries. And so this is a shadow system through the stablecoin market, and the banks needed to do this in reaction to the alternative, which is people convert their bank deposit into a stablecoin, and that creates a run on the bank. And so again, crony capitalism, but everybody in America is saying, yeah, we're winning. You got to be aware of how the devil's in the detail as well. Right, a few more things that came out in the details in terms of what they put in there was a prohibition on paying interest and rewards from those stable coins unless you are a registered bank. And so basically, this means that banks are able to pay yield on their stablecoin, while stablecoin issuers like Circle and non-bank institutions, they're not able to pay yield on their stablecoins. They have to be registered with them, but in order to pay the yield, they basically have to register as a bank. And so, even if you're issuing stable coins from a bank and through their affiliates, you're still not able to do that as well. So basically, this is a mechanism for stopping non-banks competing with traditional banks to prevent people wanting to convert their bank deposits into stable coins, and give the banks the ability to do that within their control structure, which is anti-consumer protection, but again, crony capitalism to the highest level, and why it is a covert CBDC as opposed to switching and taking on the banks with stablecoins. This was the banking lobby in full swing, and everybody just signed up to it, and very few people actually went into the detail and noticed it. So this really helps the big banks and the banking system adjust to this, and it also pressures stablecoin issuers to essentially get a banking license. And once they get a banking license, they can offer those lending services, and then they can lever up. So this is a way of gobbling up the stablecoin issuers into the banks that will probably be pushed through mergers and acquisition. And another example of how the Trump administration essentially works for the banks via the bank lobby. And that is the same with Biden. This is bipartisan. Any long-term listener will know that by now. They just want you to think that it's the Republicans versus the Democrats, as we always come. But this helps protect the current banking system as we move into a more digital, a more tokenized economy. And you can bet your bottom dollar, BlackRock is looking to do some of the tokenization alongside with this as well. But by pushing the stablecoin issuers like Circle, but to be a bank, you can essentially, they can get access to Federal Reserve accounts by applying for banking licenses. And by having an account with the Fed, it means that they end up being able to create that faster, more convenient technology without needing the bank in the middle, because they become a bank and they can have access to those reserve accounts. This is regulatory capture. This is protecting the existing system, and this is dressing up a CBDC into an acceptable narrative via the stablecoin market without the control handing over to just one institution, the Federal Reserve. Hence why you had these little theater battles that we'll be covering this week in macro between Trump and Jerome Powell as we make these transitions. These games are being orchestrated from the top, and you're meant to believe that this is MAGA. And once you understand that it's not, you can stop wasting your time with politics. And in part 3, I'll be covering where you should be implementing your time if you want to really make a difference in the world. Anyway, so non-bank institutions will be registering with banks, and then they can settle directly. And what system do they have to settle directly? FedNow, which is a central bank digital currency, which they said only a central bank digital currency needs to go via Congress, with the exception of the one that's already launched, and with the exception of the stablecoin issuer that is not a member of Congress, which is Trump through World Liberty Financial. Crony capitalism at the highest level anyway. So as more and more tech companies start to act like banks, this is the part between the technical industrial complex, the financial industrial complex is getting more blurry as well. So as we continue to watch this, I'll be covering the detail every week, as I always do. And if you like these details, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Let's take a look at some of the other things that are happening around the world so that we can recognize that this isn't just a US play. This is a global play. So in reaction to this, Ghana has basically officially launched their license regime and regulatory regime for crypto platforms. There are virtual asset service provider regimes that are following the Financial Action Task Force, which is a way of the US controlling different parts of the proof of weapons network by basically harmonizing these digital dollar regulatory structures. But the interesting part comes not from the digital dollar, but the resistance against the digital dollar and the opportunity it gives to countries to basically become more sovereign by building their own Bitcoin strategic reserves and payment systems based upon their own country goals. This is a resistance to free yourself from it. Now, what did we have in the UK? Now, the example of what happens when you are not free from the proof of weapons network is what is happening in the UK. The UK is the beta test disaster case of all disasters. And our finance minister in the UK, I left the UK in 2015. I could see where the country was going. But Rachel, was it Reese? Yeah. Basically was pushing out, and I'm not sure whether this is fake news or real news, but there was articles that were pushing out that one of the strategies for figuring out how to survive their debt crisis is to selling the $5 billion of Bitcoin that the UK has in order to plug some of the hole. This is just a mechanism of the UK and European strategic weakening campaign that I've been covering for months as a result of the economy being fully vassalized into the proof of weapons network, where essentially the UK is just a node for the proof of weapons network that currently has BlackRock as the current CEO, as it were. But at the same time, the UK was making announcements. Remember, UK's strategy, they said, we're going to do AI. But what does that actually mean? What they actually mean is that they're integrating government data into artificial intelligence, because they don't have the cheap gas from Russia that they need in order to power this artificial intelligence, because they're buying the expensive gas from America, which is why the proof of weapons network invested heavily in creating the Ukrainian war so it could profit from the war and strategically weaken Europe by antagonizing the Putin escalation. And we'll be covering more of that in part 3 on the geopolitical section and how the Ukraine-Russia war is benefiting the proof of weapons network and who's profiting from it. But anyway, now the UK government is handing over all of that data over to OpenAI, so that it can start building software and artificial intelligence for the Department of Education, the Department of Defense, the Department of Security, and the judicial system and the Department of Justice. A partnership with OpenAI that will later be integrated into the proof of weapons network that has the backdoors through the NSA into Palantir and the surveillance system. UK is just simply a node operator for this network as we transition into this command and control technocracy of central bank digital currencies with the Genius Act and stablecoins experimenting with these different models. So on top of all the Palantir surveillance that the UK already signed up to in the Department of Defense, in the National Health, they've basically already built, they're now doubling up on OpenAI. And it basically said that OpenAI and UK will have signed a deal to use AI in public services. This requires massive amounts of energy, and this is going to be powered where? Because if UK was acting in its own self-interest, Europe needs cheap gas from Russia, which is why this was always an operation to destroy essentially European Union, big Germany, and the European Central Bank, destroying Germany's manufacturing base by it not being able to access either its nuclear energy or its cheap gas needed, which wiped out Europe and vassalized it into the private equity industry that is securing the country on cheap, while sovereign wealth funds in Qatar and various other regions are acquiring more and more assets as BlackRock also acquires more and more assets for their portfolio companies in order to fully control the region and use the government as a lobby tool for the interests of their profits rather than the interest of the people. So there is going to be global energy shortages worldwide for all of this artificial intelligence, which is why I believe, and I've covered repeatedly in the geopolitical sections, that we are moving to a negotiation for nuclear energy and powering all that energy in the Middle East. And we're having these final parts of escalations to hit a new era, which I've been covering constantly. We'll cover more in part 3. Well, anyway, UK is basically the beta surveillance, economic disaster. They're now looking at whether they're going to test wealth tax to help you understand what that means. Now, I'm not saying it will happen, but there has been an exodus. The largest exodus of millionaires and billionaires is happening in the UK from anywhere in the world. They're mainly going to the UAE, where they can acquire assets in the UK on the cheap because they're not going to be subjected to the wealth tax of the local people. What does a wealth tax do? It allows assets to be sold in distress because those that are levered up have to sell their assets in order to pay tax. So if you implement a wealth tax in the UK, it means that every year you'll have to value your property or real estate and pay tax even though you haven't even sold it, which means you need to borrow against your real estate to lever them into the banking system, and you become a distressed asset for the bank's enslavement. It also means if you start a business in the UK, you would need to value your business every year, which is an incredibly hard thing to do, and pay a wealth tax on the value of your business in the UK, even though it's an illiquid asset that you can't sell. And so you'd have to borrow against your business in order to pay the tax. What about your Bitcoin in the UK? If they implement this, you'd have to take your Bitcoin, which they're now going to say you must disclose on your tax return, and then you'd have to sell some of your Bitcoin to pay your tax, or the government, basically means that anybody that has asset in the country like the UK will turn the entire economy into a collateralized debt obligation, which is why everybody is leaving, so that only the people that are enslaved by debt are left, which is what's causing more crime right now, while they also have immigration policies specifically designed to fuel racial and religious tensions, so that everybody says, why is this happening? Those immigrants are taking my job, when it's actually the proof of weapons network classical play managed by BlackRock as CEO, because governments are subordinate to their lobbyists. And that's exactly what's happening right now. UK is a complete beta test. Now, I don't actually think it will be happening. I don't actually think they would really turn UK into such a distressed asset, but nothing would surprise me, considering what they're doing in Ukraine right now, where they're essentially profiting to the last Ukrainian because they compromised Zelensky in order to take the European Central Bank and Bank of England printed money in the proof of weapons network and buy all those weapons from BlackRock's portfolio company in the US. So US can print some growth and GDP while they profit to the last Ukrainian, and Zelensky constricts 18-year-olds and younger people to fight in a war they know they can't win. We'll be covering more of that in part 3. So they are losing in the UK millionaires and billionaires. And in fact, the data is actually showing that high-end real estate in London, through Chelsea, Kensington, Mayfair, is selling at like 40% discounts at the moment, because the wealthy people are selling in order to leave in case there is a wealth tax. And so you're getting corrections in the high-end real estate market in London, and it's probably people like BlackRock and their funds that are going to be able to purchase those assets, just like they're doing in the private equity market right now. This is what happens when you securitize and financialize all of your assets and opt into a quote-unquote democratic system where you're meant to be pushing democracy out there, when really the whole thing was just a ruse in order to end up with vassal states that are controlled by those that end up with all the capital as a result of the debt-based Ponzi scheme, which has got nothing to do with capitalism and everything to do with a scam called central banking. Which is the inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed result that I tried to warn everyone against in my 2011 book. Wow, 13 years ago, 13 years ago that was published. 14, yeah. Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. And by the way, if you want a free copy of that, make sure you head over to simondixon.com. Join for free the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. I'll send you a newsletter with all these updates so you're protected, and you can get a free copy of that and lots of other content. We back it all up, just in case one day YouTube shuts me down here. Anyway, in order to protect yourself as a country, UK is selling its Bitcoin while US is meant to be buying Bitcoin. Remember, that was the promise of the Trump administration. Well, so far, as I covered last week, the Bitcoin strategic reserve in US, poof, just disappeared from 200,000 to 28,000. There's been no updates on that. And the US strategic reserve is essentially becoming a Trump family strategic reserve, and a Steve Witkoff strategic reserve, and a Howard Lutnick strategic reserve. And so you need to understand that they're not MAGA. They're not making America great again. They're making themselves great again, and you should do the same as well. And that's what we always warned against. As long as you get Bitcoin in self-custody, don't listen to them, follow their money instead. And so no updates on the US Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. We'll keep following that story. Make sure you subscribe to my channel to get updates. Also, if YouTube ever takes me down, I also have this as a podcast on Spotify. Then you can watch it bit by bit, and you can download it and have it bit by bit. Also on Apple Podcast. And I also stream these on X. So follow me over there, where I give real-time updates throughout the whole week that I consolidate into Bitcoin Hard Talk. And also follow me on Rumble, because it's more censorship resistant. One of the largest shareholders is Tether, so we'll see where that goes. But also Bitcoin Hard Talk on simondixon.com. I've got my own infrastructure, so I can back up everything in case it all goes wrong. So we're meant to be receiving a release from the White House this week. It's going to be a Bitcoin and crypto report That's going to come out on July the 30th. I'm not sure whether it will be covering any update on the Freedom of Information Act requests for where the Bitcoin Strategic Reserves Act is happening. But I'll make sure I cover that if there's anything interesting. And the Proof of Weapons Network financial terrorists decided to try and delegitimize the El Salvador movement that is trying to free itself from the Proof of Weapons Network that has done covert regime changes and guerrilla warfare by funding militias and gangsters in order to take over resources in El Salvador. And now President Bukele managed to essentially do a deal with the gangs and arrest those. And obviously they had to sign up to IMF debt. They launched the Bitcoin strategy, made Bitcoin legal tender, started building Bitcoin strategic reserves. They've been adding 1 Bitcoin every day. And the IMF tried to negotiate that if you want our money, because they didn't have enough Bitcoin, and if they had been more aggressive, maybe they could have freed themselves from the IMF. Instead, the IMF says you got to stop buying Bitcoin. Bukele put out a public announcement like he's still defying the IMF, and the IMF decided that they would expose El Salvador in a public interview. And we don't know which one is true because we can see on the chain that 1 Bitcoin is going into the El Salvador public address. But the claim is from the IMF is that El Salvador has not bought any Bitcoin since signing a loan deal with the economic hitmen at the International Monetary Fund. And so there was a recent public webinar with the economic hitmen financial terrorists at the International Monetary Fund. And it was asked whether El Salvador is still buying Bitcoin or whether they're just shifting coins between Bitcoin wallets from already purchased Bitcoin. And the IMF confirmed that El Salvador is simply shifting. And so either the IMF is lying or El Salvador is deceiving because it wants to continue the strategy, but it is being roped into the International Monetary Fund, economic hitmen, tools. And that is why you know that Bitcoin is a bigger threat than they want to let you know, because you can't trust a damn word that the International Monetary Fund says. And remember, Bukele and El Salvador had that big meeting with all the global South central bankers and finance ministers that were looking at also implementing Bitcoin strategic reserves, which freaked out the International Monetary Fund. And at the time, I went and met President Bukele to work on the Bitcoin bond, which suddenly went from having all the subscriptions to suddenly no longer being a project. At this time, I thought, you know what? I'm just going to work with the people only to build their Bitcoin in self-custody and report on all these things that are happening, because really that was the original mission. And it makes me think, do we even want these governments protecting themselves with Bitcoin? Because really, it's about the separation of money and state, which was the original mission. And while countries can free themselves from the financial terrorists at the International Monetary Fund, we also have a trust me bro system with the governments as well. And so, look, I'm all for countries building these strategies, but recognize the real difference is a bottom-up movement where you own Bitcoin in self-custody rather than having a government own it for you. And I was on a space yesterday. Max Kaiser came up and he said that they've currently got $100 per Bitcoin per capita in the current system, but we can't trust anything. So I say, don't trust, verify. Is it the IMF? Is it the government? I don't trust either. And that's what Bitcoin was designed to do when it was really created as a bottom-up movement of us versus the banks. And so please, 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 the message is make yourself great again, because they're probably not going to make America great again, because they work for the Proof of Weapons Network. And it is a mafia. And in doing a deal with the IMF, you have to opt in to the economic hitmen and financial terrorists and the terms and conditions as they weaponize the dollar and they try and make the dollar more attractive globally, which perpetuates the debt cycle, the death and the destruction, the war and the violence that these covert operations happen as a result of creating a debt-based Ponzi scheme with the Federal Reserve at the heart of it that has now been used in order to co-opt to the very top of the proof of weapons network. So in part 2, this week in macro, I'm going to be covering the shenanigans and the theater that happened between Trump and Powell, who work for the same banks. And we're going to give some updates on what happened this week in macro. And I'm also going to leave you with a blog that I created today around the question, who really controls the proof of weapons network? And in the comments section, I often see people saying it's the Jews. And so people think when I'm saying the proof of weapons network, I'm talking about a Jewish conspiracy. So I'm going to finally debunk that, put it to bed, and help you understand the truth, because without truth, there is no peace. And so we're going to cover that in part 2 of this week in macro. While I'm grabbing a little bit of water and while we transition over to part 2 this week in macro, I'd like you to add a comment in this section, help me with the algorithm, and also hit the like button and share this with somebody else. And we're going to be back. We've got a lot more to cover with you this week in macro, and who really controls the system. And we're going to be doing in part 3 this week in geopolitics, where I'm going to be going through the updates in China, Taiwan, Ukraine, Russia, and how you can fight back the system when you realize the government doesn't work for you. So let's move over to part 2 shortly. Welcome back to part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91. This week in macro. In part 1, we covered the covert central bank digital currency and the IMF battle with the Bitcoin strategy in El Salvador, as well as the suicide mission of the UK and their Bitcoin strategic reserves, and the disappearing Bitcoin strategic reserves of America. In part 2, we're going to be covering 2 main topics. I'll cover everything that happened this week in macro with the tariffs and everything else. But of course, we're going to be covering shortly, I'm going to play a video of the theater that happened between Trump and Powell at the headquarters of the Proof of Weapons Network, the Federal Reserve. And I'm going to be pointing you to a blog where I covered and demystified the whole conspiracy theory around who controls the world, who controls the Proof of Weapons Network, when people in my comments always say it's the Jews that control it. I'm going to make sure you understand the truth, and I'm going to cover that all within the context of what happened this week in macro. So what happened this week? Well, we've been having this slow build-up. We've been covering this all the way before Trump was in control. I said you'll have this battle between Trump and Powell, and the fact that Trump mainly is represented by the financial industrial complex and the technical industrial complex. The Fed has both the financial industrial complex as well as the military industrial complex. And there's a battle as more military becomes technical and more financial becomes more technical. You got this power struggle at the top, and Powell is the mechanism for protecting legacy finance, while Trump is there protecting legacy finance as well as this transition into the technical factions as well. And so Trump has been calling for Powell's resignation. He's been posting it on Truth Social. He's been calling it out on his various interviews when he gets off the plane, and all these different, kind of Jerry Springer drama that we're used to in the real world. And he's been calling the Federal Reserve to do the highest decrease in rates, 300 basis points, which during COVID, we only had 100 basis points, which in the history of the Federal Reserve was the highest decrease. Trump wants to do 300 basis points. So you can take the distressed debt of America that needs to be refinanced and refinance it at the short term at the lower rates, which would send the long-term rates out of control, so that the banks and financial institutions get their higher rates on the long term, and he gets to refinance the debt at the short term, and a typical BlackRock type of distressed asset vassalize the economy further into debt enslavement, debt dependency that causes more civil unrest, because the haves, those close to the central bank, get the benefit. Those that don't own the assets get more and more enslaved into debt slavery. And then you can usher in the surveillance state that is going to be packaged up as pretending it's for border control, when Palantir's technology just gets used on you through the privatized military like ICE, as it is beta testing with its partnership between America and El Salvador through the privatized prison sector and deportation business model for the proof of weapons network right now. And Trump has been perfect. He's done everything that they want to usher in. And obviously the Jeffrey Epstein that we covered last week files are being used in order to ensure that he does exactly what they say, weaken his support at the base, and just be weaponized, because it's the proof of weapons network that control the Epstein files. I don't even think Trump has access to those. I'll cover a few more updates that in part 3 as well, the geopolitical section as well. So what did we have? We also had Congresswoman Luna that came out and filed an actual criminal referral against the Federal Reserve and the chair, Jerome Powell, and that is actually happening with the Department of Justice around this refurbishment that allegedly has taken $3.1 billion from taxpayers in order to make the headquarters of the Federal Reserve nice and pristine. And there was a bit of a theater that we've become used to. We covered the Zelensky theater and the South African president theater, the Keir Starmer theater, these theaters. But now this one was done at the Federal Reserve headquarters as well. At the same time, while this was happening, while Trump was visiting the site at the Federal Reserve and the refurb, that now has a Department of Justice case against it, which Trump is weaponizing in order to ask Jerome Powell to retire, to engage in this strategic weakening of the dollar campaign. Bessent came out and said that the Fed needs complete restructuring. So the MAGA fans get to say, we're taking on the deep state and the European bankers, when really it is giving more power to the yield, because all these assets sit on the back. I've got ahead of myself. Let's watch the video first. So just before we do that, in this video, basically Trump told Jerome Powell in the Federal Reserve that you must lower interest rates. And this is amid the basically $3 billion refurb. So enjoy the theater, and then we'll come back into what it actually means for macro. And Azad, if you could play the video with Trump and Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve. Let's play that now.
Well, thank you very much. We're looking at the construction, and we're with the chairman, as you know. Chairman, come on over. And we're just taking a look at what's happening. You know, it's a tough construction job. They're building basements where they didn't exist or expanding them, and a lot of very expensive work. There's no question about it. And Tim has been with me for a long time, and you're in charge of the committee.
Indeed. One of the reasons I wanted to see it was the overruns of the expenses, wanted to figure out why.
Yeah. So we're taking a look, and it looks like it's about 3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard that from anybody at the Fed.
Yeah, it just came out.
Our notes had it about 3.1 as well.
3.1.
3.2.
This came from us?
Yes. I don't know who does that.
You're including the Martin renovation. You just added
our entire capital.
Yeah, you just added in a third building is what that is. That's a third building,
Well,
including
no,
the
but
Martin building.
it's a building that's being built.
No, it was built 5 years ago. We finished Martin 5 years ago.
It's part of the overall work.
But it's
So,
not new.
So we're going to take a look. We're going to see what's happening, and it's got a long way. Do you expect any more additional cost overruns?
Don't expect them. We're ready for them, but we have a little bit of a reserve that we may use, but no, we don't. We expect to be finished in 2027. We're well along, as you can see.
Nice to take these off every once in a while when we're not under too much danger. So Any questions?
Mr. President,
as
does
a
the
real
issue
estate
give you any?
developer, as a real estate developer, what would you do with a project manager who would be over budget?
Generally speaking, what would I do? I'd fire him.
Do you think this issue, Mr. President, gives you cause to do that?
Well, I'm here just really with the chairman. He's showing us around, showing us the work. And so I don't want to get that. I don't want to be personal. I just would like to see it get finished. And in many ways, it's too bad it started. But it did start. And it's been under construction for a long time. It's going to be a real long time because it looks like it's got a long way to go.
Yes, sir.
So.
President, are there things the chairman can say to you today that would make you back off some of the earlier criticism?
Well, I'd love him to lower interest rates. But other than that, what can I tell you? The country is doing really well. I just briefed the chairman on the deal we made with Japan. Japan is putting up $550 billion in order to lower their tariffs a little bit. That way they have a little bit lower tariff. And they also opened their country to free trade, which nobody thought was even a possibility. And we get a zero tariff in the free trade. We don't pay tariffs, and they're going to pay 15% on everything they send into our country. So it's great. But they put up, as you could call it, seed money. Let's call it seed money. You could call it anything you want, but it's a total of $550 billion. So nobody thought any of that was possible, and it's wonderful. And we're doing pretty well with the European Union, likewise. And we have some others. They're all really big, and our country's going to make a lot of money. We would be helped if interest rates would come down, but we're going to see how the board rules on that soon. I'd love to see them come down a lot. But we have a country that's thriving. We had a dead country 1 year ago. Today we have the hottest country anywhere in the world. And we'll get this one finished.
Mr. President, do you
Thank
think
you.
that Jerome Powell's a numbskull?
Okay, so obviously it is hugely comical for us to watch the what looks like the overpowering president of the United States executing his humiliation ritual on the way more powerful Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is a vital part of the proof of weapons network. It's not the top, the asset managers are the top, but is the enabler of the monetary policy when the banksters meet every week and the chairman is not the almighty or powerful. He's a puppet for the banks. But the president is also a puppet for the bank lobby and the other lobby interests that he needs to serve. But obviously the game has to be that the president looks like the almighty king. And this was a humiliation ritual around the strategic campaign that I've been covering ever since Liberation Day, that I said the tariffs would weaken the dollar, and now we're getting the trends as a result. The more and more of these campaigns we get an ever weakening dollar, and we get the cost on the 10-year bonds and the 30-year bonds in that bull market. What that means is that the government has to pay more in order to lend to anybody that wants to lend to the US government for 10-year and 30-year. If you have to pay more because bonds are crashing, it means that people are not willing to lend unless you're willing to pay a higher rate in these auctions. And so Trump's strategy is to basically forget about the free market, do fiscal dominance, which means spend like crazy, give free subsidies to the military industrial complex, the technical industrial complex, the financial industrial complex, hand over as much money, have a $5 trillion debt ceiling so that you can engage in crony capitalism, but you can force the Fed to cut the rates right down so that you pay a small amount on the short-term interest rate, which is kind of acting like a distressed emerging market debt, collateralized debt obligation, which is Trump's strategy. So then they can try and grow while they usher in this artificial intelligence and robotic technocracy, and the tariffs reset the world order and divert capital around the world because you don't want to pay those tariffs. And it also creates a bit of inflation internally. And it's not going to rebuild the manufacturing base unless it's done by artificial intelligence and robotics, which takes away jobs. So you need to protect yourself amongst these inflationary, deflationary, unemployment, employment, where the unemployment numbers, I keep reporting them, and then they come back and say, oh no, that wasn't the number. So they keep lying about the employment numbers. And then what are they doing with these stimulus, big, beautiful bill? The government's employing more people. So you're ending up with this, government getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the banks ending up with all the debt, the stablecoin issuers able to handle that debt on the short term. And then long term, you're getting these higher and higher rates, which support the assets on the Federal Reserve, as well as the banks and the financial industrial complex, which have like $10 trillion of assets that it always needs to roll over. This is essentially a collateralized debt obligation on a debt-based Ponzi scheme where the debt is the beneficiary of the Federal Reserve and the bank. So let me just walk through a little bit of the flow so you understand it, and then I'll tie it into tariffs. And then I'm going to share a little bit around a blog that I created so you can understand who really benefits from this stuff when you actually follow the money. Okay, so basically now you know Trump works for one of the most important lobbies, which is the bank lobby. And the shareholders of the Federal Reserve are the banks. And so the banks get to implement their Federal Reserve policy. You put in a puppet chair that essentially the Trump administration or the current president appoints, because remember, Trump hired Powell in his last administration, kind of forgetting about that and trying to blame it on Biden and the Democrats. And you got to believe all this. It's the Democrats. They control the proof of, they're the corrupt ones. The Republicans, we're taking on the deep state. When they are the deep state, it's all the same system, just a different flavor. But the Fed is owned by the banks. So remember that the shareholders of the Fed are the banks. The banking lobbies are essentially one of the most powerful lobbies. So you pay for their political campaigning, you pay for Trump, and Trump's second largest backer after Elon Musk, which is part of the technical industrial complex, was the Mellon banking family, legacy banking family. His third was Adelson, which is the Israel part, the Israeli lobby, and she's a big investor in illegal Israeli settlements, hence why he wants real estate by engaging in these crimes that we'll be covering in part 3. And what does the Federal Reserve have? Well, quantitative easing, which we're told it has been engaging in quantitative tightening, which it has, but it still has $2 trillion of mortgage-backed securities on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. In total, it's got $10 trillion of government debt and mortgage-backed securities. Now, the Federal Reserve pays its shareholders a 6% dividends to the banks. The amount in excess goes back to Treasury, which is meant to reduce the amount of tax that is paid. But the banks get to create the digital dollar every time they issue a loan, which is mainly backed by real estate. And so when you have a strategy that Trump is following of fiscal dominance, which means essentially the government just spends its way into growth by creating fake GDP prints, by making the average American that doesn't own assets inflation. And then that money goes back around to the corporations that have the biggest lobby, the technical industrial complex, the financial industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And so who is this strategy good for? It's good for the banks. So the banks get monetary policy and fiscal dominance. That's why the debt-based Ponzi scheme was created this way. It's a predatory value extraction tool to benefit those that are closest to the money printer. And nobody is closer to the money printer than those that get to create the digital dollar, which is the banks themselves. And we covered more on the stablecoin side in part 1 this week in Bitcoin. And so the long-term rates are steadily rising the more crazy the economy goes, which is good for the bondholders or the ones that are going to be, buying those 10-year and 30-year bonds, which is the banks. That's their collateral. They can then issue stable coins against it, as we covered in part 1. And this is hugely beneficial for the banks. Now, the banks are global, so they don't care about America first. They can invest globally, and whatever happens in America, they're happy to keep rolling it over, and they'll just use it as a host country for the debt capital markets, equity capital markets, and the technocracy and the military might. So essentially, they get to socialize the losses and privatize the gains again. And that's the way the system is rigged. So if you want to, if you want to beat the system, because many people are blaming the boomers that benefited from this system, like in 20 years, their houses quadrupled in price. And there is no way that the new young generation are able to buy houses anymore, because their wages are not increasing at the same rate that these houses are inflating and these assets are inflating. So it's creating a lot of tension between the young and the old. And the young are essentially waiting to inherit those assets because they can't get ahead in the system. And the older people are benefiting from it because they don't want it to end, because they don't want the assets to go down in value before they retire. And at the same time, you've got all these people that are about to retire that is putting stress on the pension system, which is why we're having this fiscal dominant strategy. It's a pure Ponzi scheme to the highest level. And as long as people will buy the debt, it will continue. But we're having those real signs of stress right now. And so what you have to do as a young person, and I want to give some practical advice here, you have to flip the system. Forget about buying your house or using a house as a mechanism, unless you're going to inherit it, in order to become wealthy, because even rents are getting higher and higher as the concentration of wealth of real estate is essentially those that could benefit from the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so you can sit here and wait for a crash when the government won't let it crash because they're owned by the banks and no one cares about the people anymore. Or you have to flip the system, which is why I've always said for 14 years, earn as much fiat currency as you can, save the difference in Bitcoin, continue to do that for 4 years. And after 4 years, everybody that's done that, and I can't promise the future, but I have been saying this all along, beats every asset class, beats real estate, beats Wall Street, beats the fund manager, beats the banks, beats the bonds, beats the stock market, beats gold, beats the commodities, beats art. And that has happened every 4 years. Once you hit 4 years of buying every month, no matter regardless what the price is, the people that I know, some of them are billionaires, some of them are millionaires, average Joe people, and some of them are continuing this strategy. They end up just buying their house outright because they saved in Bitcoin rather than saving in fiat currency and lending it to the US government or the UK government or wherever you're from in your local currency. So you have to save in an asset that outperforms the market and then eventually just buy your house. And this happens to also, and I'll be tying this together in part 3 when I talk about practical strategies in the geopolitical section about how we can boycott the war machine. And also at the end of this, in terms of understanding, this is how we take on the proof of weapons network. And so this is the strategy that I ask everyone to follow. Now, is there risk in Bitcoin? Maybe you want to hedge it with gold and various other things. There's risk in all of this stuff. But it has consistently provided a neutral asset that has beaten all other assets because of its fixed money supply that no one can change. Now, let's look at some of the other asset class and the alternatives. So for the last 15 years, I've been investing in private equity. I often talk about, I try to disclose my private equity investments. I've been investing in many of the different companies in Bitcoin and various other private equity investments. But now, as the world is changing, we're seeing that traditional private equity investors are needing a stimulus because they can't find the liquidity in order to sell those shares. And so we're seeing in this new environment more and more distress in the private equity market. One of the things that I've been working on is converting all of my private equity into Bitcoin, because I don't want the human risk anymore. I don't want all the hassles that can happen when you can just have this one asset that has taken out the human risks. Not financial advice. You need to do what's right for you. I don't know your situation. I can't give this generic financial advice. Obviously doesn't work when I don't know your situation. But what has been happening is that the private equity lobbies have been lobbying the Trump administration in order to allow the 401k pensions in America to be able, those providers to be able to open up to private equity. Now, this is one thing. When you have the 401k pension providers lobbying the government saying, we would like our pensions to have access to private equity, that's about inclusion in a vibrant asset class. Because historically, before Bitcoin, you had to invest in private equity to get the higher returns. And that was, what I used to do. So when I worked in investment banking, I was doing it in public markets. But once I got into the private markets, I was doing private equity and centered around Bitcoin, which was the higher performers because of Bitcoin as well. But liquidity is completely drying up at the moment. So if it is the private equity sector lobbying and not the pension sector lobbying, then to me, I interpret that as wanting to dump their private equity on retirement funds of everyday people because institutions aren't buying. And remember, institutions, the fastest growing ETF for institutions is the Bitcoin ETF. So you got to read between this as well. And so what might be happening here, and again, just following the money, I can't prove the flows, I'll keep following the flows, but the private equity part of the financial industrial complex of the proof of weapons network, companies like Blackstone, may be dumping on the mutual funds and the pension parts of the financial industrial complex. And this is another reason why I prefer Bitcoin than holding Bitcoin with BlackRock or having BlackRock manage my pension. Again, I can't, don't take this as financial advice. You really need to manage your risks, your situation. But I'm just saying generically, BlackRock, through their pension funds, could be buying the private equity through its other parts of the portfolio. Massive conflict of interest. And the way that private equity works is it's very hard to price it. And so what you often do in our private equity deals, sometimes you have people do a low deal at a lower price, and then that becomes the price, or you can do a higher deal at a higher price. That becomes the price. And when you're dealing with your own people in your own networks, you could end up dumping this private equity at higher prices, finding more liquidity while they go into more liquid assets. And these are the types of things that tend to happen when you're having moments of mass disruption around, like we are with this transition to artificial intelligence. And now we have an asset class like Bitcoin as well. So you can do a small deal in order to get a price for a higher deal. And if you can find a liquid market, then you could be dumping onto the pensioners again. And so, look, I think this is more appropriate for a IRA where people manage their own pension and they can make their own decision. But when it comes to somebody else manage, I see massive conflicts here. It could be the formation of the next scandal. And it could be a way of getting illiquid assets in a distressed private equity market into more liquid markets and you holding the bag. So I'll keep watching this as well. At the same time, this $9 trillion locked up in 401 are also going to be able to invest in Bitcoin and crypto. So they could be hedging, saying, we'll dump our private equity, but we'll hedge it with Bitcoin and Bitcoin, quote unquote, crypto. But this is what's happening in the 401k. Is essentially they get a fee, they get to dump their positions, and then if Bitcoin continues to outperform, it will be offset some of the losses from the private equity, and they get to say, well, we gave you market returns when you could have just had the high returns of Bitcoin anyway, by understanding some of this. Anyway, we discussed more on Bitcoin being in 401ks last week as well. But speaking of conflicts, I wanted to point another thing that's happening in the macro market. So we've got distressed private equity. I discussed in the real estate market and some of the things that are happening as well. But there was also a conflict around the tariff policy. I noticed that Cantor Fitzgerald and the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick of the Trump administration was the person that founded Cantor Fitzgerald and now handed it over to be managed by his son. But they launched a new product, which was essentially buying tariffs from distressed small business. So remember what I said, the impact of tariffs. You have bankruptcies in all the small markets that are sucking up the tariff. And this is what's happening right now. We're getting an increase in bankruptcies. The large multinational institutions can gobble them up and offset their tariffs in the international negotiations and markets. But what they're doing is they're saying, we will buy your tariff, and if the tariff doesn't happen, we'll refund you, but we'll keep 20%. And so I don't know whether tariffs will or will not happen. I think that they're going to come through. But anyway, this is a product from somebody that would have insider information, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, through his institution, creating a product saying that tariffs may not happen and will get a cut if they work out differently from what is in the contract. And so this could be complete insider trade. And this is the types of things that we're seeing as the market gets more and more distressed on the macro side, that there's ever more corruption to increase these prints to make it look like there is growth as well. Now, at the same time, we had lots and lots of announcements around tariffs, because remember, the next key deadline is August the 1st. That's just around the corner. And so in the humiliation ritual between Trump and Powell, he was bragging about the deal that was being done by Japan. So let's go through into some of the deals that we've got already. Now, remember, there were some deals that were being done that led to Trump issuing a stable coin where the negotiated money that was going to be invested went via World Liberty Financial, which is Steve Witkoff and Trump, both on the administration. And then he gets to receive the interest on the bonds from those stable coins as he gets more deals to go through via these types of mechanism. Well, Trump struck essentially a trade deal. Now, remember, the trade deal is not for America. It's for the proof of weapons network. Its government is subordinate to the corporate interests. And so Trump's job is to negotiate deals for these global multinational financial institutions. So he announced that deals have been done with Japan, with Philippines, and with Indonesia, three major Asian countries, major trading partners. I'll quote, it was in the humiliation ritual, I think he said, Trump said, Japan will invest $550 billion into the United States, which will receive 90% of the profits. I'm not sure what that means. The devil's in the detail. I'd have to understand the flow of money of exactly how that works, but we don't have the details yet. Japan will open up their country to trade, including cars, trucks, rice, and certain other agricultural products, and other things, he said. And basically, Japan's prime minister came out and said that he welcomes the announcement on Wednesday. And he's adding that he expects the agreement, quote, to contribute to the world economy. Japan's tariffs rate was set to increase to 25%, he said on Wednesday, but it was announced at 19%. But there was confusion around reciprocal. So does that mean that it's 19% on both sides? But it looks like it's going to be, it was announced that it was going to be kept at 15%, but in the end, he said 19%. So we'll see what the final thing is. But he said this is the lowest figure to date among countries with trade surpluses with the US. And so the agreement basically does not include any reductions on tariffs on the Japanese side. and that includes the agricultural products. So we're getting these conflicting messages between announcements. And obviously, I've covered in previous episodes in macro the importance of following. If Japan goes on its own strategy, the Japan carry trade and the various other things, and how Japan is sowing signals for what could happen within America. You can check out previous cutouts if you want to watch that on my YouTube channel and specifically get into that topic. But in the end, essentially, he announced that there would be a 19% tariff on Japan, and also on imports from the Philippines. And also Indonesia is set to get the 19% rate. So across the board, we're seeing these higher rates in Brazil for political reason. It looks like we may be getting an average of about 25%, which is higher than the current 10%, which means that we haven't seen the inflationary impact yet. Still all to come throughout the Trump administration, which is why Jerome Powell was saying we don't know the impact yet, so we're not going to be lowering rates because inflation has had a rebound, while Trump is pressuring, and this is why we're getting the weakening of the dollar and more distress in the market as a result of the sophisticated investors repricing based upon this destabilization campaign. It's agreed that Indonesia will be opening up the market to America industry and tech products and agricultural goods by eliminating basically 99% of their tariff barriers. So large multinational financial institutions that are not America first, that host themselves on the US stock market, are having more and more free trade so they can offset any tariffs in the international markets, while they also purchase any of the distressed companies. And as I said, this is consolidation of wealth to the top, which is why I've always thought the tariffs was BlackRock's policy, and they allowed Trump to play president to reset the world order into these multipolar world and consolidate power up to the top. There was a quote, the United States of America will now sell American-made products to Indonesia at a tariff rate of 0, while Indonesia will pay 19% on all of their products coming into the USA. Now, they frame it as that, but remember, the tariff is paid by the importing company. And America, to have world reserve currency, needs to, by Triffin's dilemma, have this trade surplus. And we now know that they're using fiscal dominance. So they don't care about paying off the national debt. So this was all a reset of the world order. And as I said, it's because China's already won the tariff war. We covered that in previous episodes. But the tariffs that are paid on the US side are paid by the importers, which increases the price and is causing the distress in the private equity bankruptcies in the smaller companies that are being purchased by the larger corporations on the cheap. Now, we also had more theater around the European Union. The European Union said that it's in planning to impose a 30% tariffs on US goods if no deal is done by the August the 1st deadline. This was also announced that they're reducing it to 15%. We had the whole tariff on, tariff off. Tariff off. Trump said that he looks like we're going to be doing a deal between the European Union. But in the meanwhile, we've got the massive strategic weakening campaign and vassalization of the European Union that I've been covering for many months now. So the impact of this basically is that the US pays 19% more on goods that it imports from the Philippines in the US. So that's inflationary. It adds to the tax revenue. So it is a tax on US companies. That's essentially what it is. The large companies will offset it in the international markets and negotiate preferential terms. So this is a beautiful deal for the proof of weapons network, while being able to invest globally in BRICS and various other beneficiaries of the deals that will be done. Now everyone's being pushed east rather than west to do deals with China. Now, meanwhile, the goods that are coming to the Philippines will not be charging tariffs. So it's good for American exports, and they get cheaper goods. But you've got the challenge with the corporation that needs to pay the tariff as well. So these are the impacts that I see so far, and I think it's in line with what I originally said on Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, that I said this is about liberating the world from the dollar, and the dollar has been weakening ever since. BRICS has been doing more and more trade with each other, and America has produced, Scott Bessent said, about $300 billion of tax revenue. And the big beautiful bill is subsidizing and more crony capitalism, and the government's employing more people. So, this is essentially Bidenomics under Trumponomics that is benefiting the banks, the financial industrial complex, the technical industrial complex, and the military industrial complex. This just shows that government is subordinate, because it's not going to help the people, Main Street, in any way unless you own the assets. So it only benefits those that own the stocks. And outperforming the stocks, meanwhile, has been Bitcoin, which is why price your stocks in Bitcoin to get the truth. Don't price it in dollars, because the weakening of the dollar is what's pumping these stocks. And then those are the executives that get rewarded in stock options. The higher the price goes, the more they get to extract. They can borrow against their stocks. They pay the interest, and they get to pump the price of their stocks and have this wealth effect, which is causing more wealth inequality from those that are not able to access these sophisticated products that help the banks. And that's really the end impact of this. It helps Wall Street, not Main Street, is when you really follow the money. We had an announcement that Trump is in the process of completing deals with China, and it's in serious talks with the European Union. So hopefully we get those announcements, and as we get those announcements, I'll keep covering them on This Week in Macro every week. There were serious corrections in the Dow Jones stocks. So don't be fooled. While stock markets are going to new all-time highs, it's the technocracy and the energy that is distorting the impact of tariffs. Because as the price of energy goes down, that is deflationary, and that's offsetting some of the inflationary. And so you have to get into the minutia of those details as well. But the Dow Jones, like the dinosaur companies, they've had really big corrections. Some of the companies can't pay dividends anymore. So there was big correction in the prices. But the big magnificent seven, the technocracy, has been pumping that up. But in America, there's real distress in the oil markets, because the lower the price, that impacts the oil manufacturers as well. And so this is why I love Bitcoin, because the complexities, what is the average person able to do? What are they going to do? They say, I can't put all this shit together, so I'm going to hand my money over to BlackRock. And that's the strategy. That's why. Whereas Bitcoin produces a counter to that. You know the monetary policy. You just have to learn how Bitcoin works. Then you have to get a setup. Life gets simpler. So Dow Jones, massive corrections in stocks, while technology props up the stock market. And you get these new all-time highs, but the devil's in the micro detail rather than the macro detail. US technocracy is absolutely inevitable, and that's why the whole economy is reconfiguring around that reality. And the reason why I believe there's going to be, a movement towards peaceful negotiations by the Proof of Weapons Network in the Middle East, which is my geopolitical type of forecast based upon following the money, because there's not enough energy to power all this artificial intelligence. And so what I wanted to do as a final section in This Week in Macro, before we go into This Week in Geopolitics in part 3, where I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into, the whole Ukraine, Russia, China, Taiwan situation, and who's profiting, a bit more on the Epstein files and some of the updates as well on This Week in Geopolitics. I wanted to point you to a blog that I recently created. Now, this was created because whenever I talk about the Proof of Weapons Network, I immediately get confronted in the comment section and with people on Spaces that immediately say to me, when you say the proof of weapons network, you mean the Jews, don't you? And so I always push back upon that and then try and explain the structure. And of course, Jewish power is one part of the faction. But I wanted to actually find out how influential and powerful is it actually? Because I've always known, the historical stories between the scapegoating, Jewish power, Christian power, weaponizing religion, all of this stuff. And I just wanted to create a blog so that whenever someone comes to me saying, is that what you mean? I'd like them to actually just have the reality. Now, there's no doubt that, there are apparently 15 million Jewish people in the world, and they have a lot of board seats, and there are a lot of billionaires that have influence in these different markets. So I wanted to drill down and find out, is it true, because of this historical context and the situation today, that is the source of power? And I knew intuitively how markets work. And so therefore, the conspiracy theory doesn't tell the whole story. But I wanted to make sure I had a blog that actually answers the question, who controls the world and who controls the proof of weapons network? And I wanted to break it down. So, my theory was that actually it's controlled by shareholders. And anybody that knows anything about corporate structure, that boards are employed by shareholders. Now, you can have CEOs that were also founders, but the power comes from the shareholders. And so when you're a founder, CEO, and shareholder, yes, you have significant power, and you could use ideological reasons, mainly in the private markets, to push an alternative agenda to profit. But in the public market, you have fiduciary duties to prioritize profits over any spiritual, religious, ideological, any type of ideology, unless it serves profit for shareholders. And you risk being sued if you deviate from that. And with public companies, you have to produce quarterly reports. And also, executives are incentivized through stock options. So the higher the share price, if you crucify your share price for ideological reasons, it's just not, it means that you don't get the maximum result. The whole system is designed around profits. And so CEOs and board members are resistant to shareholders. So what people do is they point out, oh, this board member comes from this religious background, or is in this tribe, and therefore they control the world. And it's just, it's a source of power, but it's not the full power. And this is understood based upon, it gives us also a way of of determining who is these powers. So I tried to find any studies around, as wealth, what are the ideologies behind different pockets of wealth? Because wealth is what determines whether you own shares. And so wealth in public companies changes because wealth is open up to global markets. And so you could have Chinese power, you can have Asian power, you can have Muslim power, you can have Jewish power, you can have Christian power, you can have, when you try and put together these groups, and it's mainly determined by wealth and stock ownership rather than executive. And so what about other sources of power, like strategic lobbying? We're always told, and I always talk about AIPAC, but I wanted to find out, where is AIPAC in relation to military industrial complex lobby? What about foreign registered lobbies like Saudi Arabia and various others? And so I condensed it all down into a blog this week, because every time somebody tells me, do Jews rule the world, or is the proof of weapons network a using covert word for Jews? I just wanted to actually have a blog where I could say them, so I don't need to answer this question or debate ever again on this topic, unless you can find some flaws in my blog, in which case I'll update the blog based upon reality, because only the truth matters. That's all I care about. And so are the Jewish people on top of the proof of weapons network, as some people would lead you to believe, which is obviously with the Gaza genocide at the moment, people are coming to these types of conclusions, and scapegoating and all these types of narratives are happening again. And so what I want to do right now is play you a little artificial intelligence summary, which will be the last thing we do in This Week in Macro, that gives you an introduction to the blog. And then you can head over to simondixon.com, go to the blog section and type in a keyword, and you'll be able to watch and read the whole thing for people that want to dive deeper into this subject. So I don't need to debate it again. And you're welcome to provide some feedback tag me on X and tell me where you think I'm wrong, and I'll update and we can do a real-time thing. And so for the final section of part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91, on whether the Genius Act is a covert central bank digital currency, I'm going to answer the question and play you a little AI summary from that blog on who controls the proof of weapons network. So Azad, if we could play the video, and then we'll go into part 3, This Week in Geopolitics.
Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to cut through the noise on some really complex stuff. Today, we're tackling a big one, a really powerful and, let's face it, often debated claim. This idea that, that the Jews rule the world. You hear it around. It's one of those claims that really needs a clear-eyed look, you know? Mm-hmm. So we're going to unpack the actual power structures. We'll be using insights from Simon Dixon, particularly his work on the proof of weapons network. Yeah. Our mission here is simple. Just lay out the information impartially. We want to clarify the complex realities, focus on the mechanisms of power. Okay, we're not taking sides on, the politically charged stuff.
Exactly. And Dixon's core idea is this proof of weapons network. He sees it as this web of powerful industrial complexes, think military, financial, tech, even pharma. And his argument is they actually engineer conflicts for profit, often by shaping narratives, funding different sides. It gets complex. And what's really striking is how he says they sometimes weaponize religion, create heroes and villains, using old biases for modern gain. He also highlights this corporate power structure, where shareholders, they have the final say. CEOs, boards, they answer to the shareholders. Mm-hmm. And it's all driven by that relentless pressure for quarterly returns.
Okay, right. So let's unpack that specific claim head on.
Okay.
The whole Jews own everything narrative, when you actually look at the data on global wealth, it doesn't hold up. The numbers are pretty startlingly clear, actually. Like, Christians own about 55% of global wealth.
55%.
Yeah. People with no religion, around 35%. Muslims, maybe 6%. And Jews, just 1%.
Okay.
1%.
Exactly. And let's talk billionaires for a second. You've got around 2,668 globally. Only about 10% of those are Jewish, which means obviously 90% are not.
90%.
Right. And look at the very top names, the ones everyone knows. Musk, Bezos, Arnault. Overwhelmingly non-Jewish. The numbers just don't support this idea of financial domination by one religious group. And actually, trends since about 2015 show Muslim-majority economies growing faster in percentage terms. Jewish wealth, while definitely influential in certain areas, is relatively shrinking on the global scale.
So, okay, it's clearly not about one religious or ethnic group hoarding all the wealth. Then who is pulling the strings? In these huge corporations, these key sectors Dixon talks about in his network, you look at the big banks, right? JPMorgan Chase, or big tech, the Magnificent Seven.
NVIDIA, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft.
Yeah.
Yeah, the giants.
And the media conglomerates, the huge military contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. Who owns them? It's mostly institutional investors, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. Those names keep popping up.
And here's the really crucial bit, I think. These asset managers, they aren't driven by ideology, Jewish or otherwise. Their loyalty, it's to quarterly returns, full stop, shareholder supremacy, which then leads you to ask, well, who owns them?
Right.
And it gets interesting because BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, they own big chunks of each other.
Seriously, they own each other.
Significant shares, yeah. It creates this really complex, intertwined web. Dixon calls it decentralized ownership, centralized control. It's a bit of a mind bender.
Decentralized ownership, centralized control.
Think of it like a web where the same few spiders control the anchor points of almost every strand. Mm-hmm. So no single person owns everything, but these few firms, they collectively wield enormous influence through all these cross-holdings.
Wow. Okay, so zooming out, it's not ethnicity, it's these huge financial structures. That really shifts the perspective. And beyond just ownership, there's lobbying, right? Political influence. Let's compare some numbers there. Pro-Israel groups, Jewish organizations like AIPAC.
The big one, yeah. American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
They put about $30 million into U.S. campaigns in the 2023-24 cycle.
Which sounds like a lot of money. And it is.
But compare that to U.S. defense corporations in the same period.
Right, yeah.
They spent $149 million just on lobbying.
$149 million versus $30 million.
Yeah. That's almost 5 times more.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture Dixon paints, U.S. policy seems driven primarily by lobbying money, military strategy, and, well, corporate profit. Not really ethnicity or religion when you follow the money. It's kind of a sobering thought, but the data points that way. And institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, even the Federal Reserve.
The U.S. Central Bank.
Yeah, they're deeply tangled up with private banking interests and these same big asset managers. The Fed itself, is technically owned by a network of private commercial banks.
Which are owned by...
largely by those institutional investors. Again, BlackRock, Vanguard. It comes back to them.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the U.S.-Israel relationship specifically, through Dixon's lens. He's arguing U.S. support isn't really about religious loyalty.
Not fundamentally, no. He calls it the cold logic of empire. In his view, Israel functions more like a strategic asset, a proxy, or he uses the term settler colony, serving U.S. geopolitical goals and, crucially, the defense industry's bottom line.
An AIPAC's role in that view.
It is basically a convenient smokescreen.
Yeah.
Something that obscures the real chain of command, the real interest at play.
That's a powerful perspective. How strategic interest might just override everything else.
So yeah, this raises a really important question, doesn't it? What's the takeaway? The real power structure, at least according to Dixon's analysis, is this consolidated system. These huge asset managers driven by profit, by endless asset accumulation. And that drive transcends any particular ethnic or religious group.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Maybe understanding this system, this profit-driven structure, instead of focusing on old, harmful stereotypes. Maybe that changes how you see things, how you view global events, the flow of power. Think about it. A system where profit often dictates action, cutting across traditional lines and allegiances. What does that really mean for the world? Something to consider next time you read the headlines.
Okay, so if you want to dig into a bit more of the details, then you're welcome to check out my blog on simondixon.com and tweet me on X, or post to me, whatever we call it now, and share what you think is you'd like to see updated on there. There is no doubt that there are powerful people, but I refuse to group everything together because I think that only leads to lazy outcomes. And so this is my blog post for any time anyone asks me that question, because the reality is that based upon everything that's happening that I'm going to be covering in the geopolitical section, Israel is really, really creating a bad reputation for all of its followers and supporters. And obviously the military industrial complex is willing to weaponize faith and religion. And also there has been radicalization. And we're going to be covering a lot more about that in part 3. But I said that we'd be focusing a bit more on the Ukraine-Russia situation by following the money, and also the China-Taiwan situation by following the money, and also give some updates on what we covered last week, just based upon this week in the Epstein case, Syria, and various other things. So we've got plenty more to cover in the final section in part 3. And I'm also going to leave the final part of part 3. I'm going to make sure that we go through some creative actions that you can take on another blog that I'll be publishing soon as well. So we're going to jump straight in now to part 3 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91. The main topic, as a quick recap, was whether Genius Act is a central bank digital currency for the US. We covered that in part 1 in This Week in Bitcoin. In the macro section, we covered the power structure of the proof of weapons network, and also the theater between Jerome Powell and Trump and the tariffs. And in part 3, we're going to be focusing on the updates on the geopolitical side and following the money, and maybe making some forecasts on where Russia-Ukraine goes next and China-Taiwan goes next. And some of those updates. So let's jump into This Week in Geopolitics, Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91. Right. So just very briefly, a couple of updates from last week. Last week, we mainly covered the Syria situation, and we also covered the Epstein files and how those are related to each other. And so Israel and Syria basically reached a ceasefire. That is the current state of events. There was intervention from the US. And I gave my reasons last week why I actually think that this wasn't a planned one, but it was an escalation towards Israel basically taking advantage of the situation in order to gain more leverage into its negotiations for the genocide that is happening right now. And we had some announcements as well after the ceasefire that Saudi Arabia, an important part of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and Syria signed a $6.4 billion worth of deals. And this is all around, I believe, the GCC, if they can get Netanyahu to negotiate his exit, and he is representing the military-industrial complex and the last bits of profits, while he monetizes a genocide and he's using his leverage in order to try and get full freedom, as I covered, and I'll be covering again today on this week. And the GCC, I think, have done all they can, but we'll dive more into that as well. Negotiating with Syria is the type of indication that I'm looking for that the GCC is going to be the new regional group of powers as they enter into this decolonization process from the US proof of weapons network and move towards harnessing energy for artificial intelligence. If they can make the area investable, which requires this negotiation between the weapons network and the various factions. Okay, so last week we also covered Epstein. There was a few more updates. I created a blog called Is Trump Blackmailed by Epstein? That's where I go through a documentary with Ryan Dawson that goes through all of the flows for people that are interested in this topic. And there's a short AI summary on that blog post as well. You just go to simondixon.com, type in the blog, or click on the blog link, and in the search bar at the bottom, I think it is, type in Epstein, and you can find all the different posts there. But Trump basically came out and officially asked the Justice Department to release to the grand jury testimony with respect to the Jeffrey Epstein files. And so this pressure from Trump support, which I think is also strategic leverage between the proof of weapons network that controls the files, is working as a strategic weakening so that Trump stays obedient as a compromise and good president for the proof of weapons network. Wall Street Journal also came out and said that the Justice Department told Trump in May that his name is among many in the Epstein files. And then Ghislaine Maxwell is using it in order to leverage her negotiation and whatever she's going to say, which we can't trust shit about. Ghislaine Maxwell, who is the handler for Jeffrey Epstein pedophilia and blackmail ring, who is the daughter of Robert Maxwell, who was a Mossad agent, and Jeffrey Epstein had deep connections, the neighbor of Howard Lutnick, who's always behind Trump in the administration, and the Israeli presidents and prime ministers that were always visiting Jeffrey Epstein, and all the things that have been released since. You can check out my blog for those that want to dig deeper into this. Well, Ghislaine Maxwell, who was funded by Lex Wexner and all of the banksters and financiers, and Jamie Dimon, and provided the JPMorgan account for much of these crimes, that settled about $280 million with victims. Ghislaine Maxwell said that they would testify on August the 11th. And so apparently we're going to get a new testimony with the list from Ghislaine Maxwell. So that's the next stage in the drama. There was a quote, the Department of Justice is cooperating and will help facilitate the deposition at the prison. So there's going to be a deposition at the prison and a testimony. And Trump says that he will not destroy Elon Musk's companies. So remember I said that Elon's using this, knowing that Trump doesn't have access to the files, knowing that the banksters are the ones that are implicated on the files and Trump's name's there, so it will never be released. And so Elon decided to take strategic advantage in order to get more negotiations for the technical industrial complex faction of the proof of weapons network. And suddenly Trump comes out and says, yes, I don't want to destroy Elon Musk's and any of his companies. And Elon, I want him to thrive like never before. And so you got the pivot there as a result of that. And to me, I interpret this as more evidence in the file that governments are always subordinate to the proof of weapons network. And proof of weapons network is determined by shareholders. And if an executive is a founding executive, also a shareholder, then they're a high net worth constitute of the proof of weapons network, as well as one of the portfolio companies, which would give you more power than a member of government or a president. And so my theory was Elon is strategically factioning off the technical, the Trump administration fan base based upon the weaponization, knowing that this will never be released. And so this kind of ties into my general theory of following the money in order to understand the control structure of wealth and the asset managers as well. So founder entrepreneurs, they do have significant power in the proof of weapons network. I also want to update on how I think the proof of weapons network, via its vassal state US, via Trump, is kind of seeing the escalations with China and Taiwan. And so this one I haven't covered for a while. And so based upon the current situation, just wanted to give some updates, and then I'll do the same for Russia, Ukraine. And then we'll move forward with the final part of this section, a few more updates on This Week in Geopolitics, and one of the new blogs that I'll be releasing in terms of how you can fight back and boycott the proof of weapons network. Okay. So currently, I do not believe, based upon following the money, that China has any plans to invade Taiwan. Because basically it cannot and will not turn Taiwan into Ukraine. Because until chips are secured, semiconductor chips, both in the proof of weapons network with America as a host country for the technocracy and China, nobody can afford to have Taiwan turn into Ukraine because it would be trillions of dollars of disruption, and it would be a lose-lose game for both China and the proof of weapons network. And so it doesn't care about Taiwan, obviously. I mean, the military-industrial complex has no care about countries. If you want to turn a country into Ukraine for profit, it will do that. That's why it has all these covert operations. But Taiwan has its silicon shield, which it's holding on to. And so it will always weaponize foreign soldiers, send them to the slaughterhouse for profits. There's no ethical consideration. The military have been doing that for years. They'll just create a new narrative that they're defending democracy in Taiwan from communism will always be the story. Sending foreign people and creating and funding militias, that's the military-industrial complex's playbook. It's always done that. We've seen this in Ukraine, and we're also seeing that in Israel right now. As I talked about, Zionism was an ideology that was created in order to recruit an army to engage in crimes against humanity, to conquer land, because America needed access to American interests, needed access to oil as well as British interests. And so over the years, it had the Balfour Declaration and everything I've covered in previous. But it's more than happy to radicalize a population, recruit an army, turn them into engaging in ethnic cleansing and genocide. And that's what's happening in Ukraine and Israel right now. Essentially, Ukraine is believing that they're fighting for their country and democracy. And I'll cover more on the chances of that. And the same is happening in Israel, where they believe they're fighting for Judaism, and military is just profiting from all of this. But right now, the proof of weapons network is doing the least profitable thing, which is profiting from defense. Now, normally, when the proof of weapons network military industrial complex is profiting from defense only, there has to be significant technical industrial complex, pharmaceutical industrial complex, or financial industrial complex profits to make up for the BlackRock portfolio. And so a China invasion would just be too much of a massive gamble. And so it's making up for the profits because it's funding and creating all the chips for artificial intelligence at the moment. So China knows that the proof of weapons network can't basically hold on to Taiwan forever, but it needs to allow Taiwan to flow smoothly until it has its own independent chip manufacturing units within the host country of the largest capital markets for the proof of weapons network, which is US. And so the proof of weapons network also knows that China knows this as well. So this is essentially why they are supporting Taiwan through the defense, and they're also supporting the techs, but they're doing deals and getting Trump to negotiate a deal with Taiwan and TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, to bring those chip manufacturing over to the US. Because eventually the military industrial complex is happy to profit from this, but at the moment it's too much of an asset to technical, and so finance is funding that as well, and they're making a load of money. But defense is never as profitable as war, and so this is how they're managing the portfolio at the moment. Eventually, once the US has their own chip manufacturing factories, which was a policy by the Biden administration and the $55 billion investment, and has been continued by the Trump administration through negotiation of deals with Taiwan and TSMC. At the same time, Intel, its own chip manufacturer, is a dinosaur company. It's really lost here. Like it's the amount of share value is lost. So it has to work with Taiwan. And obviously Taiwan needs the rare earth minerals, which brings us into the Ukraine, Greenland, Mexico, Canada, types of situations, because China has a monopoly on those rare earth minerals that Taiwan needs. And so America long-term has to build up that before there can be any profit from the military industrial complex and the proof of weapons network. Taiwan knows this, because it knows that it is at risk by both China's long-term goal of reunification, but without having the complete economic destruction and the potential profits from the US proof of weapons network as well. And so by building these factories in the US and doing deals between TSMC, this is kind of signaling to the proof of weapons network that it's not interested in a war, and China will not invade Taiwan at the moment until this situation is reunification and stabilize. And so at the same time, this is basically incentivizing China not to act now. And so this is why I believe that there will only be militarization in Asia Pacific, in Japan, in Philippines, if they could, Indonesia, in Indonesia and Taiwan, which is why you're seeing these Asian countries as the first ones that are being negotiated into the tariffs, as well as the vassalization of any of the strategic assets in the multipolar world order, because they're being pushed closer to China. And so the proof of weapons network wants to get as many distressed acquisitions that I covered in the macro section in the private equity market as well. So the proof of weapons network is signaling to China that there's an opportunity to take Taiwan without turning it into Ukraine in the future by rebuilding these factories as well. And so China knows it can reunify, which is its long-term goal, but there won't be the complete global economic destruction by vassalizing Taiwan into Ukraine, and the Silicon Shield holds as well. And so at the moment, China's just watching this progress. And that, I think, is deeply interconnected into the trade war and why we're having many of these different... And that's why China, powering BRICS, is building as well as many of its oil strategic reserves, its gas strategic reserves, and just crushing it on all areas at the moment, because it definitely wants Taiwan long-term as part of its one China policy, but it will wait 100 years if it needs to, because that's the way that China works. This is its defense against the century of humiliation. And this is why it's patience, and it is working with the Global South, partnering with the GCC, because the Gulf is propping up the petrodollar through Saudi Arabia, but its number one customer is China. And so China is normalizing between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Iran saying we'll only stop the resistance if there is a Palestinian cause, which is strategically weakening Israel. But Israel is a big part of the military-industrial complex, which requires, and I'll be covering in the final section, the American military-industrial complex to retreat, which means doing a deal with Netanyahu. Netanyahu wants his freedom. So you've got this one psychopathic, genocidal maniac, which is weaponizing genocide and starvation, holding up all of this deal and all of this progress, because the military want the last bits of profits, and this is taking longer than I thought. So I've gone a little bit ahead anyway. So meanwhile, Trump is basically saying that the United States will send Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine. And so all of the profits has to come for military from Ukraine and Europe, which is why we got this whole strategic weakening campaign in Europe, defense profits in Asia Pacific, and the last bits of profits from the Middle East held up by these psychopathic negotiations when you follow the money. So what was announced in the media is that Trump has privately encouraged Ukraine to step up deep strikes on Russian territory, and it has asked Zelensky, quote, if he could strike Moscow. And this was according to a Financial Times report. The reason for this is because America needs growth, America needs GDP, and Europe is being vassalized and weakened. So Trump went to the NATO summit and said, the ECB, please print a bunch of money, and then European countries spend it on the US military-industrial complex, Palantir, surveillance, all that type of stuff. And then $1 trillion can be made, and this essentially makes up for the growth that America needs, and that will create lots of inflation within Europe as well against the European people. It's basically called GDP on the US dollar proof of weapons network, and whether the government prints it in Europe or the government through Big Beautiful Bill, that's how you basically stimulate economic growth for the dollar. You can sell weapons, basically to the last Ukrainian. And so Zelensky, that is also an agent for the Proof of Weapons Network, will continue to say, we're defending Ukraine. And so you can get the European Union to take on the debt, take on the inflation. You can boost the US stock market. The Proof of Weapons Network is happy. The military-industrial complex is happy. The financial-industrial complex is happy. Ukrainian is going deeper and deeper into debt. It's now got $181 billion, which is over 100% of its GDP. They're already skipping $600 million in payments on basically GDP warrants. And so BlackRock is issuing these warrants against their GDP. They're completely economically vassalized. And so Ukraine is complete toast from this operation, but they need the media to still believe that we're defending democracy. This is completely unsustainable from both humanitarian and financial perspective from Ukraine. This is why we started to see in Kiev the first signs of uprising and riots against Zelensky, because people are starting to realize what's happening as more and more information is going. There is an absolute debt spiral in Western, taxpayers, basically, and BlackRock can profit from their portfolio. And this is why none of the leaders in the West are working in the interest of European people. We heard from the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov. He said Russia is not concerned about US President Trump's threats against BRICS and also the aggression that happened in Netanyahu's visit at the White House. And basically, let's follow the money and understand why this is such a tragedy. It's such a human tragedy. We're led to believe that we're supporting democracy. But the reality is that you've got a battle, a proxy war with Ukraine between Russia, a nuclear power, and the proof of weapons network via its host nation, US, with Trump negotiating for the profits of the different faction. Now, the proof of weapon network, basically, all Russia, whoever rushes to get a solution on Ukraine, whether it's Russia or the proof of weapons network, whoever comes first to negotiate loses. Because the longer this goes on to, whoever holds out will basically gain the upper hand over Europe, because this was about strategically weakening Europe. Europe needs the natural gas from Russia. Eventually, it has to do that because it can't afford the expensive gas from America. So you either get vassalized into the proof of weapons network, which is what's happening, or you partner with BRICS, and the European leaders are all doing the opposite of what is in the interest of the people, because they push this narrative that Putin is Hitler. And America's already, through the humiliation ritual at the White House when he invited Zelensky, said that's not the case. And then immediately J.D. Vance came over to Europe and said, all right, and they did the NATO negotiation. And so Europe needs to keep up the narrative, but it's strengthening Russia and it's strengthening the proof of weapons network that BlackRock also came over to visit Keir Starmer. And you've got the Gulf interests because the bailout in UK is happening via Qatar. And then you're getting these destabilization campaigns around immigration that's causing racial tensions and religious tensions within the country. And so these, it's just a portfolio management exercise for BlackRock. Now, Russia is never going to concede to the proof of weapons network because it's a nuclear power. It has no incentive to do that. So none of the peace negotiations lead anywhere, because it wants complete submission from NATO and the proof of weapons network, that it's not going to expand onto its border. So it's got absolutely no pressure to do that. It can carry this on for as long as possible. Because of its partnership with BRICS, it's got a lower debt to GDP, and it can keep supplying and supporting India, who's a rising force that BlackRock is trying to vassalize as well, which is why you're getting the strategic tension between India and Pakistan. So what did Russia come out? It says that it's starting to build new trade routes with Pakistan as well. And so BRICS is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Sanctions no longer work. I covered it last week when you've got your 18th round of sanctions from EU. And by having an oil price cap, it destroys Europe and makes the Russian oil cheaper for India and China, and allows them to get more reserves, which means that China can now compete with OPEC And so all of these sanctions are just driving more power into this multipolar world and BRICS. And so, there's no pressure for to do that. Now, the proof of weapons network is crushing it out of Ukraine. It's making ginormous profits. The longer this goes on for, the more profits the military industrial complex gets to make, because defense in the China-Taiwan situation is not as profitable. And it's got this final situation of needing the energy from the Middle East for its artificial intelligence. And so it's not going to have the forever war model in the Middle East if you can get Netanyahu to negotiate whatever it is. And he represents military and lost profits as well. And so you're basically in both players. They stand to gain the longer this goes on for. More profits for the proof of weapons network, and more profits for BRICS, and more profits the weaker Europe gets, which will be vassalized either into Russia or the proof of weapons network at the end of this. So it's a completely tragic game, because you've got a corrupt Zelensky that represents the proof of weapons network and the military industrial complex. So both stand to lose if they make a deal. And so you're in a game of chicken where whoever comes first. The proof of weapons network, they lose if they concede on any settlement, because essentially they'd get unnecessary trade, and ongoing profits will just get weaker as a result of that. And so then they can't take over more of the European markets, and they don't get to provide more of the security. And so they want this to go on for as long as possible. And Russia is in basically the exact same situation, where it would unnecessarily give away more than it needs to in Ukraine. And it would have a weaker grip on Europe. And then the proof of weapons network can wash, rinse, repeat a new operation via either Poland. And so it's just a complete tragic game. Both are basically strongly incentivized to reject any kind of peace deal. And if anyone comes to the table, it's basically totally against, and it's basically complete submission by either Russia or the proof of weapons network. So everything you're seeing on media is a complete lie for show. That's why USAID was funding the BBC. That's why 100 journalists retired, because they were being told what to say with their stance on Israel. They're a bit less clued up on the Ukraine side. And that's why it was the Proof of Weapons Network via USAID was funding the Ukrainian media as well, because it needs to fund to the last Ukrainian and make them believe that they're going to support them all the way. So everything on the media is completely for show. It's basically to justify why a resolution can't be reached, and you get the clown show and the theater that we're seeing. In reality, neither player wants a resolution right now. And the Proof of Weapons Network and the military industrial complex is brutal. They've never cared about humans. They care about profits. They'll sacrifice humans. And that's been the complete, indication that we've seen. So basically, I don't know how to tell you this, but US and Europe, they're part of that operation working for BlackRock, and BlackRock wants Ukraine to turn into rubble. And that's the same with the Russian situation because of the NATO expansion. And so Russia basically eventually will have total control of Ukraine, the way that I see this. And it will go on for years because of this game. And eventually Russia will have access to Europe, because Europe will be completely economically destroyed the longer this goes on for. And the Proof of Weapons Network will basically eventually exhaust all of its profits through militarization. And they'll keep sending to the last weapon, and then they can build them again. And eventually, when that happens, after the $1 trillion is printed from the European Central Bank, they'll do a deal. And the deal will hand over to Russia. And so I hate to say this. This is what I've been warning on all along. all of those Ukraine flags in social media, all of the we're defending democracy, all of the was just pure theatrics for the proof of weapons network. And I don't see any recovery for Ukraine from here. And the only way is to gain sovereignty and actually work in the interest of the Ukrainians. And I don't see any of that happening. Europe is the massive loser from this. Europe completely loses. And this is why we're seeing the annihilation of the economies as well. Obviously, the countries that have their own energy, the Baltics, the Norwegians, the Swedish, the Swiss, outside of they're in the European Economic Area, but they're not in the European Union. They have their own currencies. They're independent of this. And Bulgaria just joined, handing over their currency to the European Central Bank, the financial terrorists of the proof of weapons network. So I think we just see a prolonged conflict. They can use this in order to spike energy prices, and that allows for Russia to maintain the economy because of its partnership with BRICS. The higher the price of oil goes, the more it strains oil and gas in Europe, the less they can be involved in the artificial intelligence side, and the more they sign deals with OpenAI and Palantir to get America to provide the oil. And so the complete vassalization into BlackRock. So Europe is being sacrificed. And that's why you're seeing all of these migration crisis talks and fueling the Israeli agents like Tommy Robinson as well. Just look into his background. You can see who he's paid for. And it's just Russian energy leverage and proof of weapons network security dominance. And both of it allows them to tighten their grip on Europe. With no incentive to counter each other. So, in summary, whichever holds out the longest, they get more of Europe. They get the energy deals, they get security deals, and they get to dictate the economic terms with Europe. So the war is going to drag on. And everything that Trump said about ending this war, it wouldn't happen under me. He's an agent for the proof of weapons network. He got NATO to pay. He's sending over the weapons. And he wants it because he wants a GDP print. So you can't trust a damn thing that he's actually saying. Weapons will keep going over to Ukraine. And so Americans, Trump's going to have to keep finding a way of winning the Nobel Peace Prize while sending more and more weapons over to Ukraine and breaking the promise. Because Russia's going to keep pushing as far as I can see. I can't see any incentives anyway. Ukrainian losses will continue to mount. It's a human tragedy. And both players get leverage. Okay, that's Russia and Ukraine. I'm sorry it's so depressing. What else have we got? Okay. So we've done China, Taiwan. We've done Russia, Ukraine. We gave some updates on last week's Syria situation, a little bit of updates on Epstein. In the final section, I just wanted to cover some of the updates of what's happening in the Middle East and Gaza, why this isn't ending. I covered my long-term prediction that this moves towards ceasefire, and that this means that in the end, the GCC becomes the players in the region, is moving towards decolonization, but the military-industrial complex via its proxy, Israel, is making more profit for the U.S. military-industrial complex and a proof of weapons network within U.S. Stock market. So in Gaza, I got the resolution's basically taking longer than I thought it would. I thought we would be somewhere by now. And I think the reason that that's happening is because Netanyahu and his grip on power basically hinges upon the coalition and the cabinet. And there is destabilization in the cabinet that I covered last week, but it's still, he's a political genius as well as a war criminal and genocidal maniac and satanic. But he's managing to keep hold of his control at the moment. and the coalition and between the cabinet and the political pressure is still going. And by keeping the war going, he basically gets to delay any type of accountability for his crimes against humanity, both in the International Criminal Court, which is why Trump is calling Netanyahu a war hero rather than a war criminal, and sanctioning the International Criminal Court. Because I believe there's a negotiation for his exit, and then Netanyahu had to face the court internally for the corruption and blackmail that they've been doing, and the probes are basically being postponed every time he escalates war. So we had the Syria escalation. He took advantage of that. And the more probes that happen, they get delayed, his cases, the longer the war goes on for. So you've literally got someone working in their own self-interest. This has basically happened multiple times now. It looks like we're going to get to a ceasefire. It looks like we get to a negotiation. And then Netanyahu finds a way of holding the cabinet together. And the only way to hold to the cabinet is to tell the radical Zionists that they're going to create more war and they're going to take over more land. And so investigations are basically constantly being postponed. And the longer the postponement, the worse the genocide gets. And now they're in the starvation campaign. So he keeps basically repeating this process because this process is working. So even in the UK actually came out and made an announcement from Keir Starmer with a letter saying that this is an unacceptable starvation campaign. And that was the first time that we had such strong language admitting. Now, this starvation campaign has been going on all along. The GCC has been negotiating in order to get aid in. Aid never gets in because Israel controls the borders. The IMF bribed Egypt. Egypt's holding the borders from preventing the ethnic cleansing. Hamas continues to resist. Funding's coming from Qatar. Iran, I believe, has stopped funding at the moment because it's entered into a negotiation, but Netanyahu's resolution needs to be done. And then we had the theater of the Iran-Israel war and the pretense of taking out the nuclear program with the US intervention that I covered in previous broadcasts. But I think Netanyahu is just trying to secure his immunity right now prior to conceding. And this is basically prolonging the timeline. And the military-industrial complex is okay because Israel's spending more. Trump has agreed to send over another $12 billion. The American taxpayer pays. The stock market gets a new print. Israel gets more corrupt money. Military gets to pay, and he gets to negotiate more leverage as well. And so we're in this tragic humanitarian crisis when by default, basically, the proof of weapons network doesn't have the urgency to enforce the peace resolution. And so that's the situation that we're in right now. I personally believe that the GCC has done all the leverage that they've had. They've negotiated all they can. They've done the normalization. China's done the normalization between Saudi and Iran. Iran is playing ball as far as I can see. There's a negotiation around the nuclear program. There has been the taming of the Axis and the faction. But at the moment, everything's failed to end the disaster. And I still believe that eventually this actually ends with peace for Gaza. But the Americans are involved in the concentration camp operation and the starvation, and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation continues to sniper people and concentrate 90% of the land. And now we're getting more and more recognition around the world that this genocide is a negotiation with the GCC. I believe everyone's aligned at the moment, with the exception of Netanyahu, and Netanyahu needs to prop up his cabinet, which have been radicalized by the extreme Zionism that agrees to keep power the more Palestinians you kill. And so we had from France, of all people, France said that they're ready to recognize Palestine as a state. This is actually a very aggressive move from France, actually recognizing it, because France is one of the Security Council members of United Nations. You've got the 5 members: Russia, China, UK, France, and America. America, for decades and decades, has been veto voting any chance of peace or Palestinian self-determination. But UK has tapped out. France started to tap out, and now it's saying that France may recognize Palestine, where 145 countries have done that. That's the majority of the world. And then this would put pressure on UK, which would then, we had, very, very strong language from Keir Starmer. Now, it's just words. At the moment, it's all just words. But if France acts, then UK may need to act. And UK basically said in their words, while they're just words, this is completely indefensible. This is a mass starvation campaign, and people are dying. And never again, the Holocaust from the World War II era is looking identical to the Holocaust that's happening in Gaza right now, inflicted by the Zionist state under the Zionist ideology, backed up by US as a colony that's paying for, so that the proof of weapons network and the military industrial complex can profit. And they are negotiating to buy the freedom of the colonized states that essentially have all the energy that's needed for this artificial intelligence and data centers that need to be built. This is how the US proof of weapons network works. So what I wanted to do is end with a final video and a final AI summary of a blog that I'm going to be releasing next week. And this one is really a practical blog around, once you realize that government are controlled by the proof of weapons network in the West, once you know that, it's pointless engaging in the political process because the uniparty is the same. So what can we engage in? Well, it's actually using our money and boycotting. And so what I wanted to put together as a blog is, firstly, understand the profits that are made from genocide as a service, starvation as a service, occupation as a service. And then we can understand what companies we need to boycott in order to incrementally chip away at their profits. And so there was an amazing paper that listed all the companies, and I'm going to put it together into a blog this week. But I wanted to create a video, and I'm just going to give you the AI summary, and this is going to be the final bit of content that we're going to be covering in This Week in Geopolitics, a Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 91. And so I'm going to play that video now, and then after the video, I'm going to do the closing comments, and that's going to be everything that we're going to do on Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 91. So Azad, let's play the AI summary for the blog that we're going to be releasing next week, and we'll make sure we put the links in the description.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to help you get informed quickly.
And today we're tackling some, well, pretty heavy material.
We are. We're looking at one perspective on how a system termed the Proof of Weapons Network is claimed to profit from global conflict.
Yeah, and our sources for this dive are mainly the work of Simon Dixon and also the really significant research from UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese.
Our goal here is simple. Unpack the claims, look at the mechanisms and players mentioned, and understand the potential actions suggested in the material.
Right, just laying out what these sources are saying.
Exactly. So let's start with Simon Dixon's idea, this Proof of Weapons Network. How does he describe it working?
Well, he frames it almost like an investment strategy, a portfolio approach.
A portfolio, but for conflict.
That's the argument, yeah. He suggests top asset managers, names like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, come up, essentially use governments.
Okay.
Particularly places he calls vassal states, maybe like the US, UK, Israel, to escalate conflicts that benefit the military-industrial complex.
Right. So fueling the conflict machine.
Mm-hmm. But then, and this is key to his argument, they allegedly profit again from the rebuilding phase afterwards.
Ah, so a double benefit there. First the weapons, then the reconstruction.
Precisely. And in this view, Israel is presented as sort of a central hub, a testing ground almost, for military tech surveillance.
Okay, a very specific and frankly unsettling framework he's putting forward.
It is. And it connects quite starkly with Francesca Albanese's research, which the source material really emphasizes.
How so? What does her work add to this picture?
Well, Albanese's research, as presented, describes a shift. It talks about moving from an economy of occupation, focused on controlling resources, to something darker.
Which is?
She terms it an economy of genocide, implying a systematic profit-driven element behind displacement and destruction.
That's a very strong term.
It is. And she specifically points to Palestine, describing it as a kind of laboratory. Yeah, for testing military and surveillance technologies. And critically, she notes, with zero accountability, zero scrutiny. It suggests this isn't accidental, but systemic.
And does she name specific entities involved in this alleged system?
She does, or rather, the source material highlighting her research does. It lists quite a few corporate accomplices, as they're termed.
Like who? What kind of companies?
Well, you've got the obvious ones, maybe. Arms and surveillance firms like Elbit Systems, Lockheed Martin, Palantir, providing tools for, the actual conflict and control.
Makes sense in that context.
And there are machinery and construction companies. Hyundai, Volvo are mentioned, linked in the source to demolition and building settlements deemed illegal.
Okay, so beyond just weapons tech.
Right. And then finance. Big banks and asset managers, BNP Paribas, Barclays, BlackRock, Vanguard again, providing funding, maybe legitimacy.
So the money trail is highlighted.
And it even extends to consumer tech. Think Airbnb, Booking.com, accused of normalizing the occupation via listings online.
Wow, okay, that broadens the scope considerably.
And even universities get a mention for partnerships with the defense sector, which the source claims lends a kind of false sense of neutrality.
So it paints a picture of a very, very interconnected web.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the implication, tying it back, is that maybe governments are less in charge than these large corporate interests driven by shareholders.
Right. Albanese has that quote mentioned in the source, doesn't she, about fingerprints?
Yeah, powerful stuff. If Palestine were a crime scene, it would have the fingerprints of all of us. Really makes you think, about that interconnectedness. What stands out to you listening to this?
It definitely raises the question. If the system is presented as being this vast and profit-driven, what leverage do people actually have? And the source material, through Simon Dixon again, does propose an answer. It focuses on the boycott.
Okay, the economic lever.
Exactly. His argument is basically, this isn't fundamentally about politics or religion for the executives involved. It's about profit. They have a fiduciary duty to shareholders.
A legal duty to maximize returns.
Right. So target the profits.
And there are examples given to back this up, right? That boycotts can work.
Yeah, the source points to Starbucks mentions a 10% share price drop after boycotts, reportedly linked to its CEO's stance on settlements.
We have a recent example.
An historical one.
Yep.
The role boycotts and divestment played in ending apartheid in South Africa. A much larger scale, obviously, but the principle.
The principle that sustained economic pressure can force change.
Yes. So, building on that, Dixon outlines his specific recommendations. His most important boycott list, as the source calls it.
And what does that involve? It's not just consumer brands, I take it.
No, it's more systemic, focused on finance and currency, particularly through Bitcoin. He suggests boycotting the Federal Reserve System by saving in Bitcoin.
Interesting. Decentralizing savings.
Then boycotting asset managers like BlackRock by holding Bitcoin yourself, self-custody.
Taking control away from intermediaries.
Right. Also, boycotting banks by not borrowing against your Bitcoin holdings, keeping that separate.
Reducing reliance on the traditional system.
And finally, a broader boycott of the whole proof of weapons network by choosing to spend locally, consciously, supporting alternatives.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, really.
Yeah.
Disengaging from certain systems,
Yeah.
engaging differently elsewhere.
Exactly. It all circles back to that core idea that if you understand where the profit motive lies, you can potentially identify effective points of pressure. It's about using that knowledge.
Definitely gives you a framework for thinking about action based on the source's perspective. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, reflecting on all this. What could it mean for your own sense of control, your personal sovereignty, to really consciously think about where your money goes, how you save, how you spend, especially with these huge economic and tech shifts happening?
Yeah, how do your own economic choices play into these larger systems? Something to mull over.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. So I'm going to be publishing a blog, and we'll put the link in the description as well as all the links to everything else that was covered in Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91. It really does feel like an entire movie each and every week, and I hope that you're enjoying that. Please leave some comments below. I do read the comments. Sometimes we get spam attacked, but don't allow that to stop you commenting, because we report them and we delete them when they happen. But sometimes we notice that people stop commenting when we get those spam attack. Please do leave those comments, because we'll go through them. And I like to read them in order to get feedback and reply as well. And it really helps us as well, so that I can make future episodes better for you. So as a quick recap, in part 1 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91, this week in Bitcoin, we covered how the Genius Act could be a US covert central bank digital currency. In part 2, we covered the macro trends. We covered the theater at the Federal Reserve between Jerome Powell and Trump. And we covered a blog of power dynamics and power structure to answer the question around the conspiracy theory, so I can debunk those that say Jews rule the world, and really a more accurate reflection of that. In part 3, we covered this week in geopolitics, and we went through the China-Taiwan situation based upon following the money and the proof of weapons network. We also went through the Ukraine-Russia situation. We went through the update in the Gaza situation, and we gave and ended with an artificial intelligence roundup of a future blog where we can productively understand the companies that we need to boycott, so that we can control money, understanding that governments are subordinate to the proof of weapons power structure. Macro and geopolitics. Always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. I want you to share this with as many people, because those who are on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network will get wrecked. Those on the right side are able to be on the right side of this change. And as we transition to this world of Bitcoin AI and central bank digital currencies, I need as many of you to be on the right side. So if you're watching this video, please subscribe on YouTube. We're over 100,000 subscribers now. Our next goal is to get to 210,000 subscribers. If you follow me on X, we also stream it over there, and throughout the week you can get live updates and actually ask me a question if you come up on one of the spaces. If you need to consume this in parts, I upload the 3 parts separately on YouTube. I also have a podcast on both Spotify and Apple for Bitcoin Hard Talk. You can download it and then listen to it in parts while you're at the gym or while you're driving. And in case all of that gets barred, we've got a couple of backups. We stream live on Rumble. I need to build my following there, so please follow me if you use Rumble. And then finally, make sure you got a membership at simondixon.com at the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. This way, I'll send you a newsletter with all updates and give you lots of goodies and everything. If all goes wrong, we'll be streaming from there as well. Because we built a whole infrastructure for that. That's everything for this week in Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91. We do this with peace, love, and unity. And I'll see you this time next week for episode 92. Peace.